You're handed a goblet. It smells like meat and metal. You just watched a knight choke on a pheasant. The jester is juggling knives, and no one washed their hands, ever. Dinner is served to try not to die. This story feasts on the absurdity of medieval banquets, events that were supposed to show off wealth, but mostly showcased bad food, dangerous entertainment, and very creative food poisoning. We'll explore how nobles stuffed themselves with overcooked swan, undercooked boar, and unidentifiable meat pies served next to mead fermented in barrels that previously held urine. Bonus, all of it was eaten with your hands. Black humor soaks into every course, burning yourself on stew, swallowing a bone whole, drinking from the wrong cup, oops, poison, or falling victim to the dancing plague right before dessert. Between choking hazards, intestinal disaster, and that one monk who always brought leeches to the table, surviving a feast wasn't about etiquette, it was about endurance. The air in the great hall was a viscous, clinging thing, a testament to 1,000 years of fires, feasts, and the regrettable proximity of unwashed humanity. It was a damp, chill autumn evening, the kind that seeped into your bones and made you question the sanity of living anywhere north of the Pyrenees, let alone in a drafty stone behemoth like Oakhaven Manor. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee with a toothache, rattling the ill fitting shutters and performing a particularly aggressive percussion solo on the battlements. But within these thick, sweating walls, a different kind of storm was brewing. A storm of feasting, of forced bonhomie, and of an opulence so blatant it bordered on outright defiance of good sense. Torches, sputtering precariously in their wall sconces, cast long, skeletal shadows that writhed and danced with a life of their own. They illuminated a scene of supposed grandeur, a meticulously crafted illusion designed to impress, to intimidate, and ultimately to distract from the stark, unvarnished reality of medieval existence. The tapestries, those magnificent if slightly threadbare chronicles of chivalry and conquest, hung heavy, absorbing the smoky effluvium of the torches and the even more potent effluvium of the assembled nobility. They depicted valiant knights in gleaming armor, noble steeds, and damsels in distress, all rendered in vibrant hues that under the flickering torchlight seemed to shimmer with a life of their own. Yet even these idealized scenes offered a subtle, almost subliminal critique of the era's priorities. Look closely, and you'd notice the distinct lack of any lavatories, the almost pathological disregard for personal hygiene, and the curious absence of any depiction of a good, thorough scrubbing. These were not mere decorative hangings. They were windows into a worldview that prized outward appearances and heroic narratives above the mundane yet crucial matters of sanitation and comfort. The initial impression, indeed, was one of overwhelming, albeit slightly grimy, splendor. It was a spectacle designed to overwhelm the senses, to create a dizzying sense of awe. Gleaming platters, stacked precariously high with foodstuffs, caught the light, their polished surfaces reflecting the leaping flames and the eager faces of the guests. The heavy oak tables groaned under the weight of their bounty, a testament to the Lord's supposed generosity and the relentless labor of his kitchen staff. The very air thrummed with the anticipation of excess, a palpable energy that promised to drown out the chill and the gloom. It was a carefully constructed facade, a gilded cage, if you will, designed to trap the unwary in a dizzying illusion of perfection. But even at this early stage, before the first goblet had been drained or the first overcooked bird had been carved, the discerning eye could already detect the faint but undeniable cracks beginning to appear in this magnificent, if fragile, illusion. The scent of roasting meat, while undeniably potent, was underscored by something less savory, a faint, pervasive musk that spoke of damp stone, unwashed bodies, and perhaps, just perhaps, a whisper of the unholy. The sheer scale of the assembly was designed to impress, a deliberate overwhelming of the senses. Imagine a river of humanity flowing through this cavernous hall, each drop a potential bearer of disease, each ripple a disruption to the meticulously crafted tableau. The nobles, adorned in their finest silks and velvets, fabrics that would, by morning, be stiff with gravy, wine, and the faint, lingering odor of perspiration, milled about with an air of self importance that could curdle milk at 50 paces. The lords, their beards often festooned with remnants of previous meals, preened and postured, their laughter booming a little too loudly, their eyes constantly scanning for social advantage. The ladies, their faces painted with a startling intensity, their gowns rustling like startled pheasants, offered smiles that were as carefully measured as their portions of the next course were likely to be. They moved through the throng with a practiced elegance, a studied nonchalance that masked the subtle anxieties of courtly politics and the ever present fear of a faux pas, or worse, a genuine social gaffe that could see them ostracized from the inner circle. The very architecture of the hall contributed to the sense of claustrophobic grandeur. The high vaulted ceilings, while intended to impress with their soaring ambition, also served to trap the heat and the smells, creating a thick, soporific atmosphere. The stone walls, damp and unyielding, seemed to sweat in the oppressive humidity, further adding to the pervasive sense of discomfort. Light, a precious commodity in these times, was provided by a multitude of torches, their flames casting a flickering, unreliable glow that played tricks on the eyes. Shadows, deep and inky, clung to the corners of the hall, suggesting the presence of unseen horrors, of secrets whispered in darkened alcoves, of potential dangers lurking just beyond the periphery of the torchlight. It was a world of stark contrasts. The brilliant, if fleeting, illumination of the torches against the oppressive, eternal darkness of the unlit spaces. The rich fabrics and gleaming metalwork of the nobility against the rough spun woolens and worn leather of their retinues and servants. The boisterous laughter and pronouncements of the lords against the hushed whispers and furtive glances of those who knew their place. The servants, a veritable army of them, scurried about with a desperate efficiency, their faces a mask of strained deference. They navigated the throng with a practiced agility, balancing platters laden with roasted meats, steaming tureens of questionable broth, and flagons of potent if dubious ale. Each movement was a calculated risk, a dance with potential disaster. A misstep, a moment of distraction, and a whole evening's worth of carefully prepared food could end up adorning the silks of a haughty baroness or the armor of a belligerent knight. Their presence, however, was largely as invisible as the dirt ingrained in their fingernails, mere cogs in the elaborate machinery of the feast, their own discomforts and hunger utterly irrelevant to the grand spectacle. They were the unseen foundation upon which this edifice of excess was built, their labor essential but their very existence in the eyes of many present barely acknowledged. The visual impression was one of controlled chaos, a carefully orchestrated symphony of excess designed to overwhelm and impress. The sheer abundance of food and drink, piled high and displayed with a reckless abandon, was intended to convey power, wealth, and status. It was a visual metaphor for the Lord's dominion over his lands and his people, a display of his ability to command resources and to indulge his guests to the point of saturation. Yet beneath this dazzling surface, one could detect the subtle signs of wear and tear, the almost imperceptible imperfections that hinted at the underlying realities. A tapestry slightly frayed at the edges, a torch sputtering with an unsettling irregularity, a servant whose polished deference betrayed a flicker of exhaustion in their eyes. These were the tiny fissures in the facade, the early warnings that the grand illusion of Oakhaven Manor, like so many such illusions throughout history, was destined to crack, revealing the often unpleasant truths that lay beneath. The stage was set, the players were assembled, and the grand performance of medieval opulence was about to begin, with all its inherent absurdity and potential for spectacular unraveling. The sheer scale of the hall itself contributed to the theatricality of the evening. It was a vast, echoing space designed to accommodate hundreds of souls, from the highest nobility to the humblest of attendants. The high vaulted ceilings, supported by massive stone pillars, soared into the gloom, suggesting a grandeur that the damp, cold reality of medieval life rarely afforded. Torches, set in iron sconces along the walls, flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted and contorted familiar shapes into monstrous caricatures. These were not the steady, warm lights of a modern dwelling, but wild, untamed flames that seemed to possess a life of their own, their smoky tendrils curling towards the heavens, a visible manifestation of the effluvium that filled the air. The air itself was a thick, palpable entity, a potent cocktail of roasting meats, burning tallow, stale ale, and the undeniable aroma of humanity, unburdened by the niceties of regular ablutions. It was a scent that would cling to clothes, to hair, and to memory, a potent olfactory reminder of the era's peculiar brand of charm. The tapestries, those supposed works of art, meant to elevate the surroundings, in fact, served as a constant, albeit unintentional commentary on the prevailing sensibilities. They depicted scenes of epic battles, heroic hunts, and triumphant coronations, a visual glorification of violence and power. Yet in their meticulous rendering of armor and weaponry, they also offered a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the ever-present threat of injury and death that loomed large in this world. One could spend an eternity tracing the intricate threads, admiring the skill of the weavers, and yet find oneself drawn to the almost comical disproportion of a knight's helm or the awkward contortion of a falconer's arm. These were not mere decorations, they were narrative statements, carefully curated to reinforce the existing social order, to celebrate martial prowess, and to subtly reinforce the idea that life, for most, was a brutal, short affair, best endured with a stiff upper lip and a healthy respect for one's betters. The impression of opulence was undeniable, almost aggressively so. Platters overflowed with food, a veritable mountain range of roasted meats, glistening fowl, and intricately constructed pies. The sheer volume was intended to impress, to convey the Lord's wealth and generosity, his ability to command an abundance that was utterly alien to the common folk huddled outside in their humble dwellings. Silver goblets, tarnished with age but still gleaming dully in the torchlight, were scattered liberally across the tables, awaiting their turn in the communal ritual of imbibing. The silks and velvets worn by the assembled nobility shimmered and caught the light, their rich colors a stark contrast to the muted tones of the stone walls and the flickering shadows. It was a deliberate, calculated display, a performance of prosperity designed to awe and to intimidate. This was not a humble gathering. This was a statement of power, a magnificent, if slightly grubby, declaration of status. However, beneath this dazzling veneer of prosperity, the discerning observer could detect the subtle yet persistent hints of the era's less glamorous realities. The same torches that cast a warm glow also produced a thick and acrid smoke that stung the eyes and coated the air with soot. The magnificent tapestries, while depicting heroic scenes, were also likely reservoirs of dust, vermin, and perhaps even the occasional stray spider. The very surfaces of the tables, polished to a high sheen, were also likely to be repositories of 1,000 past meals, their wood grain a testament to centuries of spills and sticky residues. The servants, though moving with a practiced grace, were also figures of visible labor, their hands often stained, their expressions a mixture of forced deference and weariness. Even the food, while abundant, was also a potential hazard, its preparation and presentation are often lacking the rigorous standards of hygiene that modern sensibilities would demand. The illusion was powerful, but it was also fragile, a carefully constructed facade that the slightest examination, or indeed the passage of a few hours, would inevitably reveal to be riddled with imperfections. The grand illusion was indeed just that, a magnificent theater of excess, poised on the precipice of revealing its less savory, more visceral truths. The sheer volume of food presented was, by all accounts, intended to be overwhelming. It was a veritable Everest of comestibles, a sprawling landscape of dishes arranged with a deliberate, almost theatrical flourish. Platters, heavy with the gleam of polished pewter and dulled silver, were piled high, each one a miniature mountain range of culinary ambition. The aim, unmistakably, was to stun the assembled guests into a state of grateful submission, to demonstrate the Lord's ability to command not just wealth, but also the very sustenance of life itself. Here was the visual manifestation of power, of dominion over the land and its creatures, transmuted into an edible, albeit potentially perilous display. But a closer, more discerning gaze, one that dared to penetrate the shimmering haze of torchlight and the thick, humid air, began to reveal the cracks in this magnificent, edible edifice. The game birds, positioned with a proud, almost defiant posture, had clearly endured an ordeal in the roaring ovens of the kitchens. Their skin, once a glossy testament to succulent roasting, had surrendered to an unforgiving char, transforming plump breasts into brittle husks. Some were so overcooked that a mere touch would send flakes of desiccated flesh tumbling to the platter, a sad farewell to the vibrant life they once possessed. Their proud beaks, meant to be artfully arranged, now jutted out at alarming angles, like tiny petrified accusations against the overzealous chef. The stuffing, if it had ever been a distinct entity, had long since coalesced into a dense, unidentifiable mass, its aroma a faint whisper of forgotten herbs lost in the pervasive scent of burnt poultry. Then there were the meat pies, the supposed pièce de résistance, their domed crusts promising a rich and savory filling. These were not delicate tarts, but substantial fortresses of pastry designed to feed an army, or at the very least, a very hungry lord. Yet the pastry itself, while undoubtedly the product of considerable effort, a testament to the hours spent kneading and rolling, often betrayed a certain resilience. It was not the flaky, yielding embrace one might hope for, but rather a robust, almost defiant shield requiring significant force to breach. And what lay within? The lumps, oh, the lumps, unidentified, unyielding lumps that defied immediate categorization. Was it beef, mutton, perhaps a particularly unfortunate pigeon that had met its end in the larder? The question lingered unanswered and for many unsettling. The gravy, meant to be a rich, unctuous sauce binding the contents together, often had the consistency of lukewarm mud, its color a murky brown that hinted at something less than savory. A truly courageous diner might approach such a pie with a mixture of trepidation and morbid curiosity, armed with a knife and a healthy dose of skepticism. The visual disparity between the intended grandeur and the actual culinary offering was in itself a form of grotesque theater. Imagine a magnificent tapestry depicting a triumphant hunt, the slain stag rendered with a noble bearing. Now imagine that stag, hours later, transformed into a greasy, leathery roast, its once proud antlers now coated in a sticky glaze. The juxtaposition was, to say the least, jarring. The effort to create an impression of abundance and sophistication often resulted in a display that was, upon closer inspection, rather unsettling. The sheer quantity of food, while meant to impress, also meant that many dishes would sit for extended periods, their initial allure fading with each passing hour, their temperature dropping to an indeterminate, unappetizing lukewarmness. The glistening sheen on a joint of meat might, under the harsh glare of the torches, reveal itself to be less the result of skillful basting and more the consequence of rendered fat pooling in an unseemly fashion. Consider the roasted fowl. While some might have achieved a respectable level of edibility, others seem to have been subjected to a prolonged and agonizing culinary martyrdom. The skin, instead of being a golden, crispy delight, often resembled hardened parchment, peeling away from the meat in dry, papery strips. The flesh beneath, exposed to the elements and the relentless heat, was often a dull, unappealing gray, its once moist fibers having succumbed to dehydration. The effort to carve such a creature was akin to attempting to dissect a mummy. The knife would scrape and snag, resisting the passage, until finally, with a determined heave, a chunk of desiccated fowl would be liberated, often accompanied by a puff of fine, dry dust. And what of the more exotic offerings, the delicacies that were whispered about, with hushed reverence? These were often the most suspect of all, small birds, perhaps quail or lark, presented with their heads still attached, their tiny eyes staring blankly into the smoky abyss. While intended to evoke a sense of rustic authenticity and the prowess of the hunt, they could also be rather disconcerting, resembling miniature taxidermy projects rather than food. Their minute portions were often as tough and unyielding as their larger avian brethren, their subtle flavors lost in the overwhelming assault of spices and salt, used liberally to mask any perceived deficiencies. The visual spectacle was further enhanced by the sheer variety, or perhaps the illusion of variety. There were mounds of glistening eels their slick bodies arranged in a serpentine tableau, their very appearance evoking a sense of primal unease. There were bowls of jellied concoctions, their colors ranging from a sickly yellow to a disconcerting translucent gray, containing unidentifiable fragments that bobbed and swirled with a life of their own. These were often presented as status symbols, their complex preparation a testament to the kitchen's skill, but their actual consumption was an act of faith, a gamble with one's digestive well being. Even the presentation of simpler fare could be problematic. The bread, while plentiful, was often dense and hard, a far cry from the light, airy loaves of modern bakeries. It was the kind of bread that could double as a weapon in a pinch, its crust capable of deflecting an errant arrow, its interior best suited for soaking up copious amounts of ale. The butter, often served in rough hewn chunks, could be rancid, or conversely so cold it was nearly impossible to spread. The cheese, a staple of the medieval diet, was frequently pungent to the point of being aggressive, its sharp aroma permeating the air, a testament to its prolonged and, one suspects, rather haphazard aging process. The sensory overload, the sheer visual bombardment of food, was a deliberate strategy. It was designed to distract, to overawe, to prevent the guests from engaging in too critical an examination of the actual quality. When faced with a veritable forest of roasted meats, towering pies, and shimmering puddings, one was less likely to ponder the specifics of the overcooked bird or the dubious lumps in the pie. The sheer volume created an illusion of generosity and abundance that for many was enough. It spoke of a lord who could afford to be profligate, who could waste, in essence, such a vast quantity of sustenance. This waste, paradoxically, was a sign of wealth. However, for those with a keener palate, or perhaps simply a more robust constitution, the initial presentation was often followed by a subtle, internal negotiation. The desire to partake in the feasting, to join in the communal ritual of consumption, warred with the growing unease about the actual edibility of the offerings. One might survey the laden table, a landscape of potential delights, and find oneself gravitating towards the safest options: a piece of bread, a draught of wine, assuming it was not too watered down or vinegary, perhaps a sliver of some less controversial meat. The overcooked game birds, the suspect pies, the gelatinous masses, these might be admired from afar, their visual impact sufficient, without requiring a direct assault on one's taste buds or a prayer to St. Anthony of Padua for digestive fortitude. The entire scene was a masterclass in the art of culinary illusion. It was a grand, theatrical overture, a powerful visual statement designed to announce the arrival of a magnificent feast. Yet for those who looked beyond the shimmering surfaces and the sheer abundance, the overture contained subtle, unappetizing notes, a foreshadowing of the discordant symphonies that would soon be played out on the plates and in the bellies of the assembled guests. The stage was set, the actors, the dishes, were arrayed in their finery, and the audience, perhaps already anticipating the inevitable indigestion, was about to be served. The grand illusion of Oakhaven Manor had begun, and its first act was a testament to quantity over quality, to spectacle over substance, a veritable symphony of slighted appetites played out on a groaning table. The flickering torchlight cast long dancing shadows across the feasting hall, illuminating a scene of determined revelry, while the platters groaned with an almost obscene abundance, and the air thickened with the mingled scents of roasted meat, wood smoke, and something vaguely aquatic, the true heart of the communal experience, the very conduit of social cohesion and potential pestilence, resided not in the solid fare, but in the liquid refreshment. Forget the individual, solitary chalices of a more refined age. Here, the communal goblet reigned supreme, a veritable king among vessels, passed with the practiced ease of generations, a silent yet potent harbinger of shared humanity, and, as it turned out, shared sickness. Imagine the scene. Lord Reginald, his ample frame draped in velvet that seemed to absorb the very light around it, his beard a landscape of captured greases and stray crumbs, lowers a large ornate goblet from his lips. The mead within, a rich amber liquid, has served its purpose as a lubricant for his genial, if slightly slobbery, pronouncements. With a hearty, booming laugh that rattles the very timbers of the hall, he pushes the goblet across the heavy oak table, its polished surface bearing the indelible marks of countless similar transfers. His neighbor, a portly bishop whose vestments are already dotted with the colorful evidence of earlier culinary enthusiasm, readily accepts the offered vessel. The bishop, in turn, takes a long, satisfying draught, his eyes closing in apparent pleasure, before he, too, extends the goblet to the stern faced knight beside him, whose metal gauntlet looks decidedly out of place amidst the soft linens and polished silver. The ritual was as ingrained as breathing, a tangible manifestation of the bonds, however tenuous, that held this disparate assembly together. The meat itself, a beverage that was purportedly the product of patient fermentation, often possessed an aroma that defied precise categorization. It could be floral and honeyed as the bards sang, or it could be something else, something that hinted at origins less than pristine. Perhaps it had enjoyed a brief, albeit involuntary, immersion in a barrel that had seen better days, a barrel that had perhaps housed something other than honey and yeast. Or maybe the fermentation process, a mysterious alchemy even in the best of times, had taken a decidedly peculiar turn, coaxed along by an inattentive cellarer who viewed vigilance as a sign of weakness. The resultant brew, while undeniably potent, could possess a certain pungency, a subtle but persistent whiff of damp earth or forgotten fruit, a whispered suggestion of the microbial party taking place within. This shared goblet was more than just a drinking vessel, it was a social lubricant, a symbol of trust and equality, however superficial. In this dimly lit hall, with the rough and tumble of everyday life kept at bay by the sheer force of the Lord's hospitality, the passing of the goblet was a gesture of inclusion. To refuse it would be a grave insult, a public declaration of distrust or disdain, an act of social suicide in such a confined and hierarchical setting. Thus one drank deeply, and one passed it on, a willing participant in the grand, intoxicating dance of medieval fellowship. The wood of the goblet, often of dark, unvarnished oak or perhaps a more expensive but equally porous carved horn, was a testament to its continuous use. Even with a cursory wipe, with a damp cloth, assuming such a cleaning ritual was even observed between passages, the residual moisture, the subtle traces of countless lips, the microscopic remnants of fermented grain and airborne dust remained. Each shared sip was a gamble, a small wager placed against the unseen forces of contagion. The meat itself, with its inherent alcohol content, might offer a modicum of protection, a fleeting shield against the more robust pathogens. But even the most ardent admirer of the amber nectar had to admit, on those rare moments of sober reflection, that the shared nature of the drinking itself bypassed many of those defenses. Consider the journey of that goblet, from the Lord's broad lips, potentially carrying the lingering essence of his afternoon's exertions, to the bishop's considerably more delicate mouth, accustomed perhaps to the sweeter, milder wines of his ecclesiastical duties. Then onward to the knight, whose rough beard might have cradled a recent meal of questionable provenance, leaving behind a microscopic bouquet of beef fat and onion. The goblet, oblivious to these intimate exchanges, continued its circuit, a silent carrier of an ever expanding microbial tapestry. It was a tangible, liquid embodiment of the interconnectedness of the medieval body politic, where the health of one was, for better or worse, inextricably linked to the health of all. The variety of individuals who partook from this singular vessel amplified the inherent risk. There was the young squire, his face still smooth and unlined, eager to emulate the boisterous consumption of his elders. There was the aging merchant, whose liver had likely seen more action than a battlefield skirmish, his system already burdened with the spoils of his trade. Each represented a unique ecosystem of bacteria and viruses, a potential petri dish of microscopic life, all contributing their unique microbial signature to the communal brew. The mead, acting as a neutral medium, facilitated this exchange, creating a fleeting, fermented microbiome that would inevitably find its way into the digestive tracts of every participant. The very act of drinking from a shared vessel was, in essence, an embrace of the unknown. It was a commitment to the idea that the immediate gratification of thirst and the social imperative of participation outweighed any rational concern for hygiene. In a world where basic sanitation was a concept yet to be fully grasped, where chamber pots were emptied into streets and fresh water was a luxury for the few, the communal goblet was not an anomaly, but a logical, if unhygienic, extension of everyday life. The Lord's hospitality was generous, undeniably so, but it was a generosity born of a different understanding of well-being, an understanding that prioritized the outward show of abundance over the inward reality of bodily health. The proponents of such customs would argue, no doubt, that the communal goblet fostered a sense of unity, a democratic leveling in the face of the Lord's overwhelming power. Everyone, from the highest noble to the humblest retainer who might be deemed worthy of a sip, shared in this one act. It was a tangible representation of the shared experience of feasting, a moment where the distinctions of rank momentarily blurred, united by the common pursuit of intoxication and camaraderie. And perhaps, in the immediate haze of mead-induced euphoria, that illusion held true. However, beneath the veneer of shared enjoyment lay a starker reality. The communal goblet was a silent, insidious collaborator with illness. A subtle cough, a fleeting sneeze, a touch of a grimy hand, these tiny, often imperceptible acts of transmission found a willing accomplice in the shared vessel. The fermented mead might offer some palliation, but it was hardly a sterilizing agent. The alcohol content, while significant, was not enough to obliterate every stray bacillus or lurking virus. The residual sweetness from the honey, the trace elements of yeast, the very composition of the brew, could in fact provide a fertile ground for microbial proliferation between the sips, turning the goblet into a mobile, liquid incubator. one could almost envision the microscopic drama unfolding. A single hardy bacterium, perhaps a Staphylococcus aureus or a Streptococcus pyogenes, hitching a ride from the Lord's moist lip. It lands in the mead, finds a cozy spot, and begins its quiet, relentless work. As the goblet passes from hand to hand, mouth to mouth, this single organism, or its rapidly multiplying progeny, becomes a part of the shared experience. The next drinker, blissfully unaware, invites this microscopic interloper into their own body, unknowingly contributing to a grand, unhygienic experiment in communal biological exchange. The contrast between the opulence of the setting and the fundamental lack of hygiene was striking, a grotesque juxtaposition that defined much of medieval feasting. The lords and ladies, adorned in silks and jewels, engaging in the very same unsanitary practices as the lowest stable boy who might be allowed a taste of the master's drink. It spoke of a world where the concept of germ theory was centuries away, where the invisible world of microorganisms was as unfathomable as the stars in the night sky, and where the social dictates of hospitality often trumped any nascent, unarticulated concerns about cleanliness. The meat itself could vary wildly in its quality and its potential for causing distress. While some batches might be well made, others could be the result of hasty preparation, using ingredients that were less than ideal. Unwashed fruit, water of dubious purity, even the occasional insect or stray hair finding its way into the fermentation vat. These were not uncommon occurrences. The pungent aroma, so easily dismissed as a characteristic of the beverage, could also be a warning sign, a subtle indicator that the fermentation process had not been entirely benign, that anaerobic bacteria or other undesirable microorganisms had taken up residence, producing byproducts that were more offensive than agreeable to the human stomach. The ritual of the goblet, therefore, was not merely a social custom, it was a profound statement about the prevailing attitudes towards health and well being. It was a testament to a society that accepted a certain level of discomfort, of physical affliction, as an unavoidable part of life. The recurring outbreaks of disease, the widespread suffering from infections and gastrointestinal distress were not necessarily seen as a direct consequence of such practices, but rather as the capricious whims of fate or divine displeasure. The communal goblet, in its shared intimacy, became a potent symbol of this shared vulnerability, a liquid sacrament of their collective susceptibility to the unseen world of disease. And so, the Lord, the bishop, and the knight, and indeed all the assembled guests, continued their merry way, sipping from the same vessel, a testament to their shared humanity and their shared, unacknowledged journey towards a common, if uninvited, ailment. The clatter of trenchers and the rumble of hearty laughter continued unabated, a symphony of medieval indulgence. Yet amidst this boisterous display of communal consumption, a more subtle, almost spectral presence began to weave its way through the fringes of the feasting hall. It was the quiet ingress of Brother Thomas, a monk whose very aura seemed to absorb the boisterous merriment, leaving behind a lingering coolness, a whisper of something other than feasting and revelry. He was not a man drawn by the siren song of roasted boar or the succulent promise of spiced venison. His gaze, when it settled on anything, did so with an unsettling intensity, often drifting, not towards the heaving platters, but towards the communal wine jug that sat as a beacon of shared libation at the center of the Lord's table. Brother Thomas was a creature of the cloister, yes, but a cloister that harbored secrets as deep and as dark as any confessional booth. His reputation, even in circles far removed from the hallowed quiet of his abbey, was peculiar, tinged with the same sort of hushed fascination that one might reserve for an alchemist dabbling in forbidden arts. He was known, whispered about in hushed tones over steaming tankards, for his insatiable fascination with the natural world, particularly its more potent offerings. His small, dark pouch, ever present at his side, was said to be a veritable treasury of the earth's more enigmatic bounty. Roots dug under the cloak of midnight, leaves plucked at their peak potency, and blossoms gathered from the loneliest, most windswept crags. These were not the simple herbs of everyday salves or flavorings. Oh no, Brother Thomas delved into the liminal spaces of herbalism, into the realm where the medicinal blurred with the overtly powerful, where a simple poultice could be transmuted into something that induced vivid dreams, or perhaps something far less pleasant. His fascination, however, did not end with the dried and the preserved. There were whispers, even more unsettling, of his peculiar habit of collecting leeches, not for any ailment of his own, one gathered, but for what reasons unknown to polite society, or indeed to most of society, polite or otherwise. The image conjured was of the monk, perhaps by the murky banks of a sluggish stream, his robes tucked up to reveal surprisingly sturdy ankles, carefully coaxing the small, slimy creatures into a carefully stoppered earthenware jar. What purpose did these voracious annelids serve in the life of a man sworn to contemplation and prayer? The speculation was wild and varied. Some suggested he was experimenting with their bloodletting properties, a practice already viewed with a mixture of respect and suspicion, even by the most learned physicians of the era. Others, with a more lurid imagination, envisioned him using them in some ghastly concoction, a dark elixir brewed in the dead of night. The truth, if it were ever to be revealed, was likely far stranger, or perhaps far more mundane, than any of these whispered theories. But the mystery itself was enough to cast a peculiar pall over his presence. His very demeanor set him apart from the jovial, if slightly brutish, company. While others guffawed and slammed their fists on the table, Brother Thomas would often retreat into a corner, his thin, ascetic face a mask of quiet observation. His eyes, a pale, almost translucent blue, seemed to absorb the very details of the scene, cataloging them with a meticulousness that was both unnerving and to some intriguing. He moved with a quiet grace, his sandals making little sound on the rush-strewn floor, a stark contrast to the heavy boots and hobnail shoes of the knights and retainers. When he did speak, his voice was a low, resonant murmur, often cutting through the din with a surprising clarity, offering observations that were either profoundly insightful or utterly bewildering. The communal wine jug, a hefty ceramic amphora, seemed to be a particular focal point for his attention. It was not the wine itself that likely drew his interest, but rather the opportunity it presented. The jug, like the goblet before it, was a nexus of shared experience, a conduit for the collective breath and saliva of the assembled company. Brother Thomas, with his keen, almost scientific interest in the transmission of substances, would no doubt have observed this with a detached curiosity. Had he, perhaps, found some subtle way to introduce his own curated ingredients into this shared pot? Was the pouch at his side not merely for the storage of dried herbs, but for the active dispensing of them. The thought, once planted, could not be easily dislodged, casting an undercurrent of unease, a quiet threat that even the strongest trencher might not protect against. Consider the subtle dance of contagion that played out around the wine jug. Every individual who dipped their cup, every lip that brushed against its rim, left behind a microscopic testament to their passage. Brother Thomas, with his knowledge of the earth's potent secrets, would have understood this implicitly. He knew that within the seemingly innocuous brew of fermented grapes, a complex ecosystem of microscopic life was already at play. But what if one could, with a deliberate hand, introduce a new element into that ecosystem, a substance that might amplify the inherent properties of the wine, or perhaps introduce entirely new ones? His interest in leeches, for instance, was not entirely misplaced in the context of medieval medicine. Leeches were prized for their ability to draw out bad blood, a concept central to humoral theory. But Brother Thomas's interest may have extended beyond the purely therapeutic. Leeches, after all, are voracious feeders, and their saliva contains hyaluron, an anticoagulant. What if Brother Thomas was less interested in the bloodletting and more in the properties of the leech itself, or the fluid it secreted? Could he have been cultivating specific strains of leeches, perhaps for their unique secretions, or even for the bacteria that resided within their digestive tracts? The mind boggled at the possibilities, all of them tinged with a certain Gothic fascination. He might have observed the Lord, whose hearty laughter was often punctuated by a rather alarming cough, taking a long, deep draught from the jug. Then perhaps the bishop, dabbing at his perpetually damp brow with a silken handkerchief that had seen better days, would refill his own cup from the same vessel. Each interaction, however fleeting, was a transfer. Brother Thomas, with his pouch of potent herbs and his jar of leeches, was a potential wild card in this delicate, unhygienic game. He was a man who understood that even the most robust health could be undermined by the unseen, and that the most potent defenses were often those that operated in the shadows, unseen and unfelt until it was too late. The very act of passing the wine jug, of dipping one's own cup into the communal reservoir, was an act of faith, a silent acknowledgement of trust in the shared experience. But for Brother Thomas, this trust was a canvas upon which he might paint his own subtle experiments. Was the faint, earthy aroma that sometimes mingled with the wine's sweetness not entirely the product of the grapes, but perhaps the subtle infusion of a particular root or herb that Brother Thomas had carefully introduced? Did the convivial mood that sometimes descended upon the hall, a mood that often bordered on the overly boisterous or the excessively sentimental, owe something to the quiet ministrations of the monk in the corner? His knowledge of herbs was not confined to the healing arts. Medieval herbalists understood that many plants possessed psychoactive properties, inducing visions, euphoria, or even terror. Brother Thomas, with his dedication to the more obscure corners of botanical lore, would have been privy to this knowledge. Perhaps his pouch contained not only remedies, but also agents of alteration, substances that could subtly shift the perceptions and moods of those who partook of the communal wine. The idea of the monk as a purveyor of altered states, subtly manipulating the very fabric of the feast through his hidden tinctures and potent powders, was a notion that would have both horrified and intrigued the Lord's court. The communal wine jug itself became, in this light, not merely a vessel of refreshment, but a potential laboratory. Brother Thomas, with his discreet movements and his alchemist's focus, could have been adding his carefully prepared concoctions to the jug when no one was looking. A pinch of this, a few drops of that, all carefully measured and disguised. The wine, already a ferment of microbial activity, would serve as the perfect medium for his arcane experiments. What were the limits of his curiosity? Did he seek to understand the effects of certain herbs on the human psyche? Or was his interest purely in the potential for subtle poisoning, a morbid fascination with the power to incapacitate or even kill without leaving a trace? The Lord, in his boisterous pronouncements, might speak of the unifying power of shared drink, of the bonds forged in the amber depths of the communal jug. But Brother Thomas, with his quiet, knowing smile, might have seen something else entirely: a shared vulnerability, a collective experiment in ingestion, a tapestry of microbial and chemical interactions that he and he alone was subtly orchestrating. The leeches, gathered from the murky depths, their bodies a writhing mass of potential, could be seen as a metaphor for the hidden dangers that lurked within the seemingly innocent. Just as leeches drew sustenance from the unsuspecting, so too might Brother Thomas's concoctions draw something from the patrons of the feast, whether it be their vitality, their sanity, or their very lives. The dark pouch, clutched so possessively, was a constant reminder of the unknown. It was a repository of secrets, a testament to a knowledge that transcended the ordinary, a knowledge that could be both beneficial and profoundly dangerous. The monk's quiet presence was a subtle disruption to the grand illusion of opulence, a reminder that beneath the veneer of feasting and fellowship, other, more ancient and mysterious forces were at play. His fascination with herbs, with leeches, with the very act of unseen transmission, painted him as an outsider, an observer whose motives were as inscrutable as the potions he was rumored to brew. He was, in essence, the quiet threat, the subtle question mark hanging over the merriment, a man who understood that the most profound transformations, both for good and for ill, often began with a single, carefully administered drop. The unraised eyebrow, the almost imperceptible nod, the almost invisible movement of his hand towards the pouch, these were the small gestures that spoke volumes, hinting at a deeper narrative unfolding within the heart of the revelry, a narrative woven from the potent threads of nature and the unsettling curiosity of a solitary monk. The Lord's Hall, bedecked in its supposed finery, had become a stage for a more primal drama than the gilded tapestries and polished oak might suggest. The guests, a vibrant, albeit unsavory tapestry themselves, had arrived not merely to partake in a feast, but to enact their own peculiar rituals of consumption and social maneuvering. Imagine, if you will, the Baroness de Montaigne, her nostrils pinched with an almost theatrical disdain, delicately picking at a sliver of capon as if it were a particularly offensive insect. Her fingers, adorned with rings that gleamed even in the flickering torchlight, moved with a studied, almost agonizing slowness, as if the very act of touching food was an affront to her noble lineage. She was a creature of porcelain and perfume, a stark contrast to the earthy robustness that permeated the rest of the gathering, her presence a delicate yet jarring note in the cacophony of the hall. Then there was Sir Reginald the Stout, a knight whose girth preceded him like a herald. He attacked his plate with a ferocity that suggested a lifelong feud with every cut of meat. His thick fingers, calloused and stained from countless skirmishes, both on the battlefield and at the trencher, were his primary utensils. A dagger, its blade well worn and undeniably functional, served as his secondary instrument, wielded with an efficiency that bordered on the brutal. He tore at the roasted boar, chunks of fat and muscle flying with each swipe, his mouth often filled to bursting, the sounds of his mastication echoing with an alarming resonance. The very concept of individual cutlery, beyond the ubiquitous daggers, was a luxury that few here seem to acknowledge, let alone embrace. Fingers were the preferred instruments, slick with gravy and grease, dipping into communal bowls and scraping the last vestiges of succulence from bone. Torn bread, rough and absorbent, served as a makeshift spoon, sopping up spilled wine and stray juices, a testament to a practicality that trumped any pretense of refinement. The air, thick with the mingled aromas of roasted meats, spiced wine, and, less appealingly, the unwashed masses, buzzed with more than just conversation. A persistent undercurrent of noise, a symphony of the uncouth, hummed beneath the strained pleasantries. The occasional cough, a wet, hacking sound that seemed to emanate from deep within the lungs, punctuated the revelry. It was the sound of lives lived in close proximity to the elements, of bodies exposed to the vagaries of weather and the constant siege of invisible maladies. The rustle of unwashed linen, a dry, abrasive whisper, spoke of garments worn for days, perhaps weeks, without the benefit of soap or fresh water. And then there was the smell, the faint but persistent odor of unwashed bodies, a primal musk that clung to the air, a stark contrast to the supposed elegance of the occasion. It was the scent of humanity in its rawest form, a potent reminder that behind the silks and the jewels, beneath the veneer of feasting, lay the inescapable realities of hygiene, or rather, the profound lack thereof. Consider the communal wine jug, that capacious amphora that stood as a silent sentinel at the center of the Lord's table. It was a vessel of shared sustenance, yes, but also a focal point of intimate, unthinking contact. Each guest, from the highest lord to the humblest retainer, would dip their cup, often a crude wooden goblet, sometimes a simple horn, into its depths. Lips would brush against its rim, breath would mingle in its humid interior, and in the warm, dark embrace of the wine, a silent, unseen dance of contagion would unfold. Brother Thomas, with his peculiar fascination for the minutiae of the natural world, would have observed this with a detached, almost scientific curiosity. He saw not merely a shared drink, but a confluence of microscopic life, a liquid petri dish teeming with the invisible inhabitants of the hall. The jovial knight, Sir Reginald, having just dislodged a stubborn piece of boar from between his teeth with a practiced flick of his dagger, would then plunge his goblet into the wine jug, the dregs of his previous mouthful swirling into the communal pot. The Baroness, ever vigilant against contamination, would hold her own delicate silver goblet aloft, gesturing for a server to pour directly into it, a futile attempt to insulate herself from the pervasive grime. Yet even this act was not entirely without its risks. The server, his hands undoubtedly less than pristine, might let slip a droplet, or the goblet itself, though presumably cleaner, was still handled by those who navigated the less hygienic corners of the castle. And what of the serving staff, the scullery maids, their hands perpetually chapped and stained from scrubbing pots with harsh lye, would carry platters of food, their aprons bearing the faint but distinct aroma of yesterday's stew. The trenchermen, their own fingers often adorned with the remnants of their previous task, would deposit roasted meats onto the communal platters, their sweat mingling with the very fare that the guests were about to consume. The air itself seemed to carry a fine mist of perspiration and ambient dampness, an invisible emulsion that settled on everything, including the food. The very act of preparing the food was a testament to this casual disregard for cleanliness. Vegetables were scrubbed, perhaps, but not always with the rigor that would satisfy a modern palate. Meats were roasted, yes, but the potential for airborne contaminants to settle on the exposed surfaces during the cooking process was a constant, if unacknowledged, threat. Even the spices, so often lauded for their ability to mask less pleasant flavors, could also serve to disguise the subtle, insidious signs of spoilage. A faint sourness, a slightly off putting aroma. These could be easily overpowered by the robust scent of cinnamon or the sharp tang of ginger. The sheer physicality of the medieval world also played a significant role in this pervasive lack of hygiene. Sanitation systems, as we understand them today, were rudimentary at best. Chamber pots were emptied, often unceremoniously, out of windows or into communal refuse pits. Animals, from dogs and pigs to poultry, often roamed freely, sharing the living spaces of humans and contributing their own biological signature to the general milieu. The floors of the great hall, strewn with rushes that were rarely replaced, became a repository for the detritus of the feast. Dropped food, spilled wine, animal droppings, and the general detritus of 100 unwashed bodies. These rushes, damp and decaying, provided a fertile breeding ground for all manner of vermin, from fleas and lice to more insidious microscopic organisms. Consider the communal towel, if indeed one even existed. Or more likely, guests would wipe their hands on their tunics, on the nearest available scrap of cloth, or even on the rushes themselves. This casual, unthinking dispersal of whatever microscopic passengers their hands carried was a potent vector for disease. A cough, unheeded and unmasked, sent aerosolized droplets carrying whatever plague or ailment the unfortunate individual might harbor, drifting through the hall, settling on food, drink, and open pores. The Baroness de Montaigne, with her dainty handkerchief, might dab at her lips after a particularly succulent morsel, inadvertently transferring any microscopic hitchhikers from her fingers to the delicate fabric. Later, she might use that same handkerchief to wipe a bead of sweat from her brow, a direct transfer of microbes to her skin. It was a cycle of unintentional contamination, a constant, low grade biological warfare waged by the unwashed masses against which even the most determinedly fastidious were ultimately powerless. The very concept of germ theory was centuries in the future, a concept so alien as to be unimaginable. Illness was attributed to imbalances in the humors, to miasmas, foul airs, or to divine displeasure. The notion that tiny, invisible creatures could cause such widespread suffering would have been met with disbelief, perhaps even mockery. And so, the feast continued, a vibrant, messy, and profoundly unhygienic celebration of life, a testament to a world where the grandeur of the occasion was inextricably intertwined with the inescapable grime of existence. The lords and ladies, knights and retainers, all participants in this grand illusion, were also unwitting contributors to the pervasive atmosphere of contamination. Each cough, each touch, each shared breath was a small donation to the invisible ecosystem that thrived within the very heart of the Lord's Hall, an ecosystem that made a mockery of the superficial opulence and whispered of the more fundamental and often brutal realities of medieval life. The wine jug, the trenchers, the very air they breathed, all were conduits, silent participants in a vast, unacknowledged experiment in biological exchange. The opulence was a thin veneer, a carefully constructed facade that could not entirely mask the underlying and often offensive truth of the grime. The grand spectacle of a whole roasted animal, a veritable monument to gluttony and abundance, was a frequent, if perilous, fixture of any self respecting medieval feast. Imagine the tableau: a glistening boar, its skin crackling like 1,000 tiny fireworks, or a plump capon, its golden brown carcass, resting majestically upon a bed of herbs, steam still rising in ethereal wisps, carrying the promise of succulence and satisfaction. These were not merely dishes, they were declarations of wealth, statements of power, and potent symbols of a lord's ability to command nature's bounty for his own pleasure and that of his assembled guests. Yet beneath this veneer of culinary triumph lay a decidedly more treacherous reality. The very act of deconstructing these magnificent beasts, of tearing and gnawing and extracting every last morsel of flavor, was an undertaking fraught with unexpected dangers. The joyous anticipation of a succulent bite could, in an instant, curdle into a silent, terrifying struggle for survival, all thanks to a deceptively innocent bone. Consider, for a moment, the portly merchant, his belly already straining against the confines of his doublet, flushed with success from a recent, lucrative trade. He approaches his portion of the roasted fowl with the unbridled enthusiasm of a man who has earned his every pleasure. His fingers, accustomed to the feel of coin and ledger, are surprisingly adept at navigating the flesh of the bird, tearing away generous chunks with a practiced if somewhat unrefined efficiency. He raises a particularly promising morsel to his lips, a glint of triumph in his eye, and then disaster. The initial sensation is not one of pain, but of an abrupt, jarring resistance. A small, deceptively smooth fragment of bone, lodged ingeniously within the tender meat, has found its mark. It wedges itself with brutal precision against the soft tissues of his throat, a tiny, unforgiving impostor in the midst of a celebratory meal. The merchant's smile falters, replaced by a look of dawning confusion, then alarm. He tries to swallow, a natural instinctive reaction, but the bone, instead of yielding, moves deeper, its sharp edges scraping against his esophagus. Suddenly, the convivial din of the hall seems to recede, replaced by the frantic thumping of his own heart, a drumbeat of panic against his ribs. He coughs, a desperate, involuntary spasm, but the obstruction remains stubbornly in place. His face, moments before ruddy with good cheer, begins to take on a bluish hue. His eyes widen, darting around the hall, searching for an understanding glance, a helping hand. But in the midst of the feasting, the merriment, his plight goes largely unnoticed, or is misinterpreted as a particularly enthusiastic bout of laughter. This, you see, is the choking hazard, a silent assassin lurking within the very heart of the medieval feast. It wasn't just the large, obvious bones that posed a threat. Often, it was the smaller, less conspicuous fragments, the bits that fractured off during the carving or the initial roasting, that proved to be the most insidious. A sliver of bird bone, no larger than a splinter of wood, could become a medieval guillotine, severing the thread of life with a swift, merciless precision. The sheer physicality of eating in this era, stripped of the modern conveniences of finely diced meats and boneless fillets, amplified the risk. Guests were expected to grapple with their food, to exert a certain force, a robust engagement with the bounty before them. This was not a delicate ballet of forks and knives, but a more primal wrestling match with flesh and bone. And in that struggle, the unexpected could, and often did, happen. Consider the scenario of a knight, his hands still bearing the calluses of swordplay, his palate accustomed to the rough and tumble of campaign rations. He tackles a leg of lamb with the same vigor he would employ in breaking a shield wall. He's not merely eating, he's conquering his meal. He might take a particularly large mouthful, an act of defiance against any potential scarcity, only to find himself suddenly, terrifyingly unable to breathe the bone. A rogue element in his otherwise masterful consumption becomes a tyrannical ruler of his airway, its dominion absolute. The onlookers might initially assume it's a jest, a theatrical display of exaggerated choking for comic effect. But the growing panic in the victim's eyes, the desperate, rasping gasps that replace his robust laughter, soon shatter that illusion. The clatter of plates and the murmur of conversation would fall away, replaced by a suffocating silence, broken only by the increasingly desperate sounds of a man fighting for his very existence. What would follow in such a dire circumstance? There were no Heimlich maneuvers, no paramedics ready to swoop in with advanced medical equipment. The options were grim and often futile. Perhaps a fellow diner, stout of heart and strong of arm, might attempt to dislodge the offending object with a forceful slap between the shoulder blades. This could, in some rare instances, prove effective, expelling the bone with a violent eruption. More often, however, it served only to drive the obstruction deeper, to wedge it more securely in its suffocating grip. The victim would claw at his throat, his face contorting in agony, his body writhing with the desperate primal urge to breathe. There was also the rather unpleasant and largely ineffectual practice of attempting to induce vomiting. A finger might be thrust down the victim's throat, a crude emetic that often resulted in more gagging and retching than actual relief, sometimes exacerbating the situation by shifting the bone's position. The sheer indignity of it all, the public spectacle of a man being reduced to a gasping, contorted caricature of himself, was a chilling counterpoint to the earlier merriment. The specter of death by choking, a sudden and ignominious end, loomed large over the medieval feasting table. It was a stark reminder that even amidst the opulence and the revelry, life was fragile, and the most mundane of acts, like eating, could harbor the seeds of ultimate peril. The careful preparation of food, the selection of the finest cuts, the skilled carving, all could be undone by a single errant bone. Consider the cook, laboring over the roaring fires, his brow slick with sweat, his arms weary from hours of turning the spit. He carves the roasted fowl with a practiced hand, his knife slicing through flesh and cartilage with precision. Yet even with the greatest care, it was almost impossible to guarantee that every single tiny fragment of bone was removed. In the heat of the moment, amidst the demands of a large banquet, a small shard might be overlooked, a minuscule oversight with potentially catastrophic consequences. And what of the guests themselves? Their own enthusiasm, Their eagerness to devour the rich offerings could be their undoing. The merchant, the knight, the lord himself, all were susceptible. It wasn't a matter of social standing or physical prowess. It was a matter of chance, of a bone's fickle trajectory, a moment of distraction, a sudden sneeze, a burst of laughter at the wrong instant, and the feast could transform into a funeral pyre, the celebratory air thick with the dust of despair. The medieval diet, with its reliance on whole meats and a less refined approach to butchery, inherently carried this risk. Game birds, like quail or pheasant, were often served whole, their delicate bones a potential hazard. Even the humble chicken, roasted to perfection, could present a small, sharp bone that, if inhaled, could lodge itself with alarming tenacity. The sheer variety of potential culprits was staggering. The consequences of a severe choking incident were dire. Beyond the immediate struggle for air, the long term effects could be equally devastating. A lodged bone could cause significant damage to the throat, leading to infection, difficulty swallowing, and chronic pain. In the days before antibiotics, such complications could easily prove fatal, turning a near death experience into a slow, agonizing descent into the grave. The tales, whispered in hushed tones around later hearths, of those who had died at the table, their faces frozen in a rictus of terror, served as grim cautionary narratives. They were reminders that the pursuit of pleasure, the indulgence in the sensory delights of a grand feast, was a gamble, a roll of the dice where the stakes were as high as life itself. The humor, of course, often lies in the sheer absurdity of the situation. Here are these proud, often boisterous individuals, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and power, brought low by something as minuscule and insignificant as a fragment of bone. It's the ultimate equalizer, a tiny piece of avian or mammalian architecture that can bring the mightiest warrior or the shrewdest merchant to his knees, gasping for air like a landed fish. Imagine the scene. A lord, mid declaration of his political prowess, suddenly clutches at his throat, his eyes bulging, his face turning a most alarming shade of puce. The conversation grinds to an immediate halt. A wave of stunned silence washes over the hall. The courtiers, ever attuned to the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, exchange nervous glances. Is this a sudden illness, a dramatic swoon, or is it the dreaded bone? The uncertainty, the sudden paralysis of the social order, is almost as potent as the choking itself. Then, the inevitable attempts at rescue, the clumsy interventions that often highlight the desperation of the moment. A chamberlain, eager to prove his loyalty, might rush forward, brandishing a goblet of wine as if it were a magic elixir. A lady, her delicate sensibilities momentarily overridden by the primal fear of death, might offer a whispered prayer, her hands clasped in supplication. All the while, the unfortunate victim fights his solitary battle, the world around him a blurry tableau of concerned, or perhaps merely curious, faces. The medieval response to such a crisis, lacking the scientific understanding we possess today, was often a blend of practical improvisation and superstitious recourse. While a strong shove between the shoulders might be attempted, so too might prayers be offered to patron saints known for their intercession in matters of health. Some might even resort to folk remedies, attempting to force down a piece of bread or a sip of water, acts that, in most cases, would only serve to further complicate the situation. The very structure of the meal contributed to the hazard. The unhurried pace, The lengthy intervals between courses meant that food was often served in large, imposing pieces that guests were expected to break down themselves. This personal interaction with the food, while perhaps lending a sense of engagement, also placed the onus of safe consumption squarely on the diner. There was no expectation of pre portioned, bite sized pieces. One was expected to take a substantial portion, to approach the bone with a degree of caution, and to masticate with diligence. The more robust the meat, the greater the potential for bone shards. A young lamb, while tender, might still yield small, sharp fragments from its smaller bones. A mature beef, roasted until its meat fell from the bone, offered larger, more manageable pieces, but the potential for a rogue splinter still existed. Even fish, a staple for many, could present a multitude of tiny, sharp bones that required meticulous removal. The social aspect, too, played a role. The pressure to appear genteel, even in the midst of hearty consumption, could lead some to attempt to speed through their meal, to take larger bites than advisable in an effort to keep pace with the more voracious eaters, or simply to avoid the perceived tedium of meticulous eating. This eagerness, this desire to maintain a semblance of order amidst the boisterousness, could easily lead to a lapse in concentration, a moment of carelessness that could prove fatal. The irony of it all was that this danger was an inherent part of what made medieval feasts so grand. The whole roasted animals, the sheer abundance, the uninhibited tearing and rending of flesh, these were the very elements that spoke of prosperity and power. To eliminate the bones would have been to sanitize the experience, to render it less primal, less of a testament to the Lord's might. And so the risk was accepted, a necessary evil, a small price to pay for such a magnificent display. The memory of a feast, however, could be indelibly marked by such an incident. The image of a fellow diner struggling for breath, his face contorted in agony, would linger long after the last morsel had been consumed. It added a layer of macabre fascination to the proceedings, a constant, albeit unspoken, awareness that beneath the surface of merriment and good cheer, a sudden, violent end was always a distinct possibility. The bones of contention, indeed, were not merely elements of the meal, but existential threats, the stark, brittle reminders of life's inherent fragility, even at its most celebratory. The culinary landscape of the medieval era, for all its perceived rustic charm and hearty abundance, was a minefield of unsanitary practices and rudimentary technology. Nowhere was this more evident than in the volatile realm of kitchen heat. Forget the precision of modern ovens with their finely calibrated dials and consistent heat distribution. Medieval kitchens were chaotic symphonies of roaring fires, glowing embers, and unpredictable thermal currents. Food, rather than being gently coaxed into perfection, was often subjected to a fiery baptism, emerging from the inferno with a ferocity that could turn even the most eager diner into a writhing victim of an oral immolation. Imagine, if you will, a feast in full swing. The air is thick with the mingled aromas of roasted meats, simmering stews, and spiced wines. Guests, their palates primed by anticipation and perhaps a generous swig of ale, lean forward, their eyes fixed on the platters presented. A particular delicacy catches a diner's eye, perhaps a rich, dark stew, its surface shimmering with rendered fat, or a piece of game bird, its skin rendered to a tantalizing crispness from its turn on the spit. The temptation to seize upon this offering, to be among the first to sample its promised delights is almost overwhelming. But here lies the peril, the insidious trap that lurks within the very heart of culinary presentation. The kitchen, the alchemical crucible where raw ingredients were transformed into gastronomic triumphs, was also a place of stark thermal imbalances. Ovens, often constructed of stone and clay, retained heat with a vengeance, but their temperature regulation was rudimentary at best. A log added too carelessly, a draft of air fanned too vigorously, could send the internal temperature soaring into the searing stratosphere, transforming a perfectly good baking chamber into a miniature volcano. Similarly, open hearths, the pulsating heart of most kitchens, were temperamental beasts. Controlling the precise intensity of the flame was a constant battle, a precarious dance between stoking and smothering. Thus, when a dish emerged from this fiery embrace, its surface temperature could be a deceptive herald of its internal inferno. A guest, perhaps a wealthy merchant, eager to impress with his discerning palate, or a noble lady, accustomed to being served the choicest morsels, might reach for a succulent looking piece of meat or a ladleful of stew. The initial contact might be with what appears to be a perfectly edible exterior, but beneath that unassuming crust, a seething core of near molten food awaited its unsuspecting victim. The act of taking a bite, therefore, was not merely an act of consumption, but a high stakes gamble. The diner might, with good intentions and an empty stomach, plunge their tongue into the heart of a piping hot pastry or a rich, viscous gravy. The immediate sensation would not be one of pleasant warmth, but of an agonizing, all encompassing burn. Imagine the shock, the delicate tissues of the tongue, the soft lining of the cheeks, the tender roof of the mouth, all instantly assaulted by a wave of searing heat. It was a betrayal of the senses, a culinary ambush that left the diner reeling. The victim's reaction would be immediate and visceral. A strangled gasp, a sudden widening of the eyes, followed by an involuntary choked sound as they attempted to expel the offending substance. The carefully cultivated image of sophisticated enjoyment would shatter instantly, replaced by a grotesque contortion of pain. They might drop their fork with a clatter, their hand flying to their mouth, their face draining of color or flushing a violent crimson. This was the inferno on the tongue, a peril as common, if far less discussed, than the more visceral threat of choking. Unlike a sharp bone, which offered a sudden, unmistakable point of trauma, the burn was a more insidious assailant. It was a pervasive, inescapable agony that spread across the entire oral cavity, rendering the diner mute and miserable. Consider the scene. A lord presiding over his hall takes a hearty spoonful of a rich pottage. He expects comfort, sustenance, perhaps a rich, savory explosion of flavor. Instead, he is met with a blast furnace. His eyes bulge, tears welling uncontrollably. He tries to politely set down his spoon, but his motor control is shot. The spoon clatters to the floor, spraying a final hot arc of pottage onto his fine tunic. He can only sit there, mouth agape, his tongue a swollen, blistered mass, the taste of cooked flesh, his own, filling his mouth. The surrounding guests, initially focused on their own meals, would turn to stare. Some might offer a sympathetic grimace, understanding the silent torture unfolding before them. Others, less charitable, might suppress a snicker, finding a perverse amusement in the lord's discomfort. The server, mortified, might rush forward with a cup of cool water or milk, a futile gesture against the deep-seated burn. The aftermath of such an incident was often a prolonged period of suffering. The tongue, sensitive and vital for every aspect of eating and speaking, would remain inflamed and painful for days, sometimes weeks. Food would become a torment, its texture and temperature amplified into instruments of torture. Even the simple act of swallowing could be agony. The joy of the feast would be replaced by a grim determination to endure, each meal a reminder of the kitchen's fiery wrath. The causes of these oral infernos were manifold and to our modern sensibilities almost laughably avoidable. The reliance on open fires meant that cooks were constantly battling flames. A piece of meat, intended to be roasted to a perfect medium, might be accidentally dropped too close to the licking flames, its outer layers instantly charred and superheated. Stews and pottages, simmered for hours, could easily reach boiling points that bordered on the volcanic, especially if left unattended for too long. The vessels themselves, heavy iron cauldrons, clay pots, retained heat with an intensity that often surpassed the food within. Even the practice of basting, pouring rendered fat or cooking juices back over roasting meat, could contribute to the hazard. The hot liquid, returning to an already scorching surface, could create pockets of intensely hot steam or fat that, when encountered by an unwary diner, would unleash their thermal fury. The lack of sophisticated thermometers meant that cooks relied on instinct and experience, which, while often honed, were not infallible. A chef who had spent years perfecting his craft could still misjudge the heat of his oven, leading to a batch of goods that were either undercooked and potentially dangerous in other ways, or, as we are discussing, dangerously overheated. The nature of medieval dining itself exacerbated the problem. Meals were often communal affairs, with large platters of food placed in the center of the table, from which guests would help themselves. This meant that the food might sit for some time before being consumed, its temperature fluctuating wildly. Furthermore, the expectation was often to eat heartily and quickly, especially at banquets. This encouraged larger, less cautious bites, increasing the likelihood of encountering an unexpectedly searing morsel. Consider the social pressure. A guest who hesitated, who meticulously examined each bite for its temperature, might be seen as fussy or unappreciative. To maintain an appearance of robust enjoyment, diners often had to simply take their chances, to bravely face the unknown thermal landscape of their plate. The consequences, beyond the immediate pain and discomfort, could be surprisingly long lasting. Severe burns to the tongue and mouth could lead to scarring, affecting the ability to taste and even to speak clearly. In an era before advanced wound care, even minor burns could become infected, leading to more serious complications. A mouthful of blisters and raw flesh was not conducive to appreciating the nuances of a fine medieval banquet. The sheer variety of dishes presented at a feast meant that the risk was present in almost every course. A delicate fish, poached in a creamy sauce, could still harbor pockets of extreme heat from the poaching liquid. A fruit tart, its pastry golden brown, might have a fruit filling that had been baked to a near incandescent state. Even beverages, warmed by the fire or spiced with hot ingredients, could pose a thermal threat if consumed too quickly. The cooks themselves, though often skilled, were also at risk. Handling searing hot platters, ladling boiling liquids, and tending to roaring fires meant that burns were an occupational hazard for them too. Yet, their focus was on production, on feeding the masses, and the well being of the diner's palate was often secondary to the timely delivery of the meal. One can almost imagine the hushed, apologetic whispers of a server to a guest who has clearly been scalded. "A thousand apologies, my lord, milady. The stew was spirited this evening." The guest, their mouth a throbbing mass, could only nod mutely, their enjoyment of the feast irrevocably marred. The lack of a dedicated hot holding system, as we understand it today, meant that food was often served directly from the point of preparation to the diner's table. This direct transfer of extreme heat was a recipe for oral disaster. There was no gentle warming drawer, no bain marie to maintain a stable, palatable temperature. It was a case of serve it hot or serve it cold, with very little in between. The irony of these culinary catastrophes was that they often occurred at the very height of a celebration. The grandest feasts, intended to showcase the host's generosity and the chef's skill, were precisely the occasions where the risk of oral immolation was most pronounced. The pressure to impress, to provide a dazzling array of dishes, often meant that the kitchen was operating at peak frenzy, with little room for meticulous temperature monitoring. Furthermore, the visual appeal of food was paramount: a golden brown crust, a bubbling sauce. These were signs of a well prepared dish. However, these very same visual cues could also indicate a dangerously high internal temperature. Diners were encouraged to eat with their eyes, but this often led them into thermal traps. The storytelling tradition of the time, while rich in tales of valor and chivalry, rarely dwelled on the mundane agony of a burnt tongue. The dramatic narratives focused on battles won, kingdoms secured, and romances consummated. The quiet suffering of a diner whose palate had been scorched was deemed too trivial, too undignified a subject for epic verse or historical chronicle. And yet, for the individual experiencing it, the pain was all too real, a searing testament to the perils of medieval dining. One might even speculate that the very concept of al dente, or medium rare, was a foreign, even absurd notion in many medieval kitchens. The goal was often to cook things thoroughly, to ensure that no hint of raw or potentially harmful ingredient remained. This often meant cooking well past the point of optimal palatability, pushing dishes into the realm of the truly infernal. The social implications were also significant. A guest who repeatedly suffered oral burns might be subtly ostracized, or at least pitied, as someone lacking in proper dining etiquette or perhaps even robustness. To be seen as too delicate, too easily incapacitated by the rigors of a feast, was not a desirable trait. Thus, many simply endured the pain in silence, their stoic suffering a testament to their social standing. The medieval kitchen, a place of both culinary artistry and thermal chaos, served as a constant reminder that the pursuit of pleasure was often intertwined with a degree of risk, and for those who dared to sample the fruits of its fiery labor, the inferno on the tongue was a very real and very painful possibility. It was a stark contrast to the romanticized images of medieval feasting, a glimpse into the less palatable truths of a time when even the simplest act of eating could be an ordeal of fire. The celebratory atmosphere of a medieval feast, while often a riot of color, sound, and scent, was underscored by a pervasive, often unseen threat: the insidious potential for poisoning. Beyond the dramatic tales of deliberate assassination, a far more common and arguably more terrifying danger lurked in the very ingredients that graced the tables of the elite and the humble alike. These were not the flamboyant, arsenic laced goblets of whispered conspiracies, but the quiet, unassuming missteps of the kitchen, the accidental adulteration of food and drink that could transform a moment of merriment into a swift, agonizing descent into oblivion. The culinary arts, in their nascent medieval form, were a delicate tightrope walk between nourishing sustenance and lethal concoction, a balance that was all too frequently and tragically lost. One of the most prevalent avenues for accidental poisoning stemmed from the misidentification of edible flora. The verdant bounty of the countryside, so readily available and so crucial to supplementing the diets of the era, was also a treacherous landscape for the uninitiated or the careless. Medieval apothecaries and cooks, while possessing a considerable knowledge of herbs and plants, were not infallible. The visual similarities between beneficial plants and their toxic doppelgangers were often striking, and a lapse in concentration, a hurried harvest, or an eagerness to introduce a novel flavor could have devastating consequences. Imagine a particularly esteemed chef, renowned for his innovative use of wild herbs, proudly presenting a delicate venison stew. The aroma was exquisite, laced with the earthy, pungent notes of a carefully selected seasoning. But within that seasoning lay a fatal error. A bundle of foxglove, its bell shaped flowers, a beautiful but deceptive purple, might have been mistakenly gathered alongside the fox's brush, a similar looking but harmless plant. Or perhaps the alluring, sweet smelling hemlock had been confused with parsley, its delicate fronds a tempting addition to a salad. The effects of such botanical blunders were rarely immediate, allowing for a cruel period of blissful ignorance. A noble lady, her refined palate appreciating the complex, slightly bitter undertones of a new sauce, might find herself feeling inexplicably unwell a few hours later. What began as a mild headache could swiftly escalate into nausea, violent vomiting, and abdominal cramps. The alkaloids present in many poisonous plants acted on the nervous system, leading to a cascade of debilitating symptoms. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, with its deceptively alluring berries, could induce hallucinations, dilated pupils, and rapid heart rate, painting a nightmarish distortion of the celebratory feast. Monkshood, a beautiful yet deadly bloom, could cause cardiac arrest, its potent toxins a swift and unforgiving end. The victims, often the very individuals for whom the meal was prepared with the greatest care, would be struck down in their prime, their last moments filled with confusion and a dawning horror as the realization of their fate began to dawn. The preparation of these herbs was also a critical factor. Some toxic plants yielded their poisons more readily when bruised or cooked in certain ways. A simple mistake in the method of preparation, perhaps overboiling an herb that should have been lightly blanched, could release a concentrated dose of poison that would otherwise have been negligible. This was particularly true for plants like water hemlock, whose roots and stems contained potent toxins that could be released into water or broths. A cook, unaware of this specific danger, might add a handful of these roots to a simmering pot, inadvertently creating a deadly elixir. The subtle differences in preparation, the precise timings and temperatures, were often poorly understood or inconsistently applied, making the kitchen a veritable laboratory of unintended chemical reactions. Furthermore, the storage of foodstuffs presented its own set of perils. In an era predating refrigeration, the preservation of food was a constant challenge. While salting, smoking, and drying were common methods, they were not foolproof. Improperly stored grains could become contaminated with ergot, a fungus that, when ingested, could cause ergotism, a horrific disease characterized by gangrene, hallucinations, and convulsions. The St. Anthony's fire, as ergotism was known, was a terrifying affliction that could sweep through communities, particularly after a poor harvest when reliance on stored grains was highest. Imagine a village celebrating a successful harvest only to be ravaged by this insidious disease. Weeks later, the bread that had sustained them now a vector of their suffering. Then there were the dangers associated with spoiled dairy products. Without pasteurization or reliable refrigeration, milk and cheese were highly susceptible to bacterial growth. While some spoilage might result in an unpleasant taste or minor digestive upset, other strains of bacteria could produce potent toxins that were far more dangerous. A particularly rich, creamy sauce made with milk that had begun to turn could, if consumed in sufficient quantity, lead to severe food poisoning, characterized by vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration. The medieval understanding of bacteria was non existent, so distinguishing between a slightly off flavor and a truly dangerous contaminant was largely a matter of luck. The very richness and indulgence of a feast, often featuring copious amounts of dairy, therefore amplified the risk. The reliance on shared food and drink also meant that a single contaminated ingredient could affect multiple individuals. A large communal pot of stew, a shared goblet of wine, or a platter of roasted meats could all become vectors for accidental poisoning. If a cook mistakenly added poisonous mushrooms to a stew, or if a batch of wine was inadvertently contaminated during fermentation or storage, the consequences could be widespread. The initial enjoyment of the meal could quickly turn to widespread illness, with diners experiencing a shared, horrifying fate. The preparation of fowls also posed a unique risk. While not directly a poison in the same vein as toxic plants, the improper handling of game birds that had died from disease could lead to the consumption of harmful bacteria or toxins. Birds found dead in the field, rather than those freshly caught or slaughtered, might have harbored pathogens that survived the cooking process. The desire to make use of every available resource, particularly in times of scarcity, could lead to the consumption of meat that was already compromised. The resulting illness, often attributed to divine displeasure or bad humors, was in reality a consequence of unhygienic food preparation. Even seemingly innocuous items could harbor hidden dangers. Honey, often lauded for its preservative qualities and its natural sweetness, could become toxic if bees had collected nectar from certain toxic plants, such as rhododendrons or oleanders. This mad honey, as it was sometimes called, could induce dizziness, nausea, and even more severe symptoms. While less common than plant based poisonings, the ingestion of tainted honey could still turn a sweet dessert into a source of considerable distress. The legal and social ramifications of accidental poisoning were also complex. While deliberate poisoning was a serious crime, often punishable by death, accidental poisoning was more difficult to prove and prosecute. The burden of proof lay heavily on those who alleged negligence, and in an era where culinary knowledge was often passed down through tradition rather than formal education, identifying the precise cause of contamination could be a monumental task. This often meant that while perpetrators of deliberate poisoning were harshly punished, those responsible for accidental contamination might face censure, loss of employment, or social ostracism, but rarely the severest penalties. Yet for the victims, the distinction was often moot. Whether intentional or accidental, the outcome was the same: suffering, illness, and in many cases, death. The historical records are replete with instances that hint at these culinary catastrophes, though they are often couched in vague terms of sudden illness or fevers that struck down banqueters. The lack of precise diagnostic tools meant that many such poisonings would have gone unrecognized for what they truly were. A stomach ailment, a sudden collapse, or a fatal fever could easily be attributed to any number of causes: imbalances of humors, miasmas in the air, or the displeasure of God. Only in cases where multiple individuals fell ill simultaneously, or where a specific unusual ingredient was known to have been used, might the true nature of the disaster begin to surface. Consider a royal wedding feast, an occasion meant to symbolize unity and prosperity. The tables groaned under the weight of exotic meats, rich pastries, and fine wines. The chef, eager to impress the assembled nobility, had sourced a particularly rare and pungent herb from a distant region. He had read about its purported medicinal properties and believed it would add a unique zest to the celebratory dishes. However, the information he possessed was incomplete. He was unaware that in its raw form, or when prepared in a certain manner, this herb contained a potent neurotoxin. As the feast progressed and the wine flowed freely, subtle signs of distress began to appear. A knight, initially flushed with victory and wine, began to experience tremors. A duchess, known for her delicate constitution, grew pale and complained of dizziness. By the end of the night, several prominent guests were gravely ill, their symptoms escalating rapidly. The feast, intended to be a joyous celebration, ended in a scene of panic and despair, the air thick not with the scent of victory, but with the metallic tang of fear and the pungent odor of spoiled or poisoned fare. The chef, his reputation in tatters, would face the unenviable task of explaining how his culinary artistry had inadvertently become a weapon. The dangers were not confined to the elite. While the wealthy could afford a wider variety of ingredients and often had access to more exotic and therefore potentially more dangerous fare, the poor were not immune. Their diets, often reliant on foraging and local produce, exposed them to the same risks of misidentified plants and spoiled foodstuffs. A peasant family, gathering wild berries for their supper, might mistakenly pick a batch of deadly nightshade, mistaking its dark berries for a more palatable fruit. A struggling farmer, trying to preserve his meager harvest of grains, might unknowingly store them in conditions that fostered the growth of ergot. The consequences for the poor were often more dire, as they lacked the resources and medical attention to recover from even mild forms of poisoning. The kitchens of monasteries, often centers of both religious observance and culinary innovation, were not exempt from these perils either. The monks, who dedicated their lives to study and prayer, also cultivated extensive gardens and managed their own food supplies. While their knowledge of herbs and their medicinal properties was often considerable, the sheer variety of plants cultivated and the occasional experimental nature of their culinary endeavors could still lead to errors. A misplaced herb in a monastic infirmary's herbal broth, or an accidental contamination in the communal refectory could have serious consequences for the religious community. The concept of mystery meats was not solely a modern phenomenon. In medieval times, without the rigorous inspection and regulation of food supplies that we have today, it was not uncommon for less scrupulous vendors to pass off inferior or even spoiled meat as fresh. The visual appeal of a cut of meat could be easily manipulated through washing or partial cooking, masking the signs of decay. A diner presented with a seemingly appetizing piece of roasted fowl or a hearty slice of beef might unknowingly be consuming meat that had begun to putrefy, leading to severe gastrointestinal distress. The vibrant colors and rich sauces of a feast could easily distract from the less savory reality of the ingredients themselves. This constant underlying threat meant that medieval dining, for all its outward displays of abundance and conviviality, was an act fraught with a certain degree of risk. Each bite, each sip, was a gamble against unseen dangers. The accidental toxin, a silent saboteur within the very fabric of the meal, served as a stark reminder that the path to pleasure was often paved with peril, and that the most cherished of feasts could, with a single fatal error, become a grim testament to the fragility of life. The memory of a loved one struck down by an unrecognized ailment, a result of a seemingly innocuous meal, would forever cast a shadow of caution over the tables of history, a quiet warning whispered in the aroma of spices and the clinking of goblets. The medieval kitchen, a bustling nexus of culinary creation, was rarely a bastion of meticulous hygiene as we understand it today. Picture the scene: a flurry of activity where the preparation of meals was as much about rustic necessity as it was about refined artistry. The cooks, their hands often bearing the indelible marks of their trade, stained with blood from butchered meats, dusted with flour, or slick with the juices of vegetables, moved with a practiced, if not always sanitary, efficiency. In this environment, the very act of human touch, an unavoidable component of food preparation, introduced a distinct layer of risk. The unseeable contaminants, clinging to skin and nails, or dislodged by a sudden movement, had a disconcerting habit of finding their way into the dishes, transforming what should have been a nourishing meal into an unwitting repository of unwanted biological passengers. Consider the humble practice of kneading dough. A baker, having spent the morning tending to a sick child or tending to the livestock, might return to his ovens, his hands still bearing the microscopic remnants of his recent interactions. The intricate dance of flour, water, and yeast, guided by these very hands, was an opportunity for a host of microorganisms to hitch a ride. A stray hair, a common byproduct of any human endeavor, could detach itself from a cook's head or apron, an almost invisible addition to a delicate pastry or a savory pie. Even the most diligent attempts at cleanliness were often undone by the pervasive environment. Fingers, grimy from unswept floors or the handling of less than pristine ingredients, would move from one task to another, oblivious to the invisible trails of bacteria they were leaving behind. The concept of hand washing as a formalized, frequent, and thorough practice was largely alien to the medieval cook. Water was a precious resource, and soap, while it existed, was often harsh and not always readily available in the copious quantities needed for rigorous cleansing between every task. A quick wipe of the hands on an apron or a splash of water from a communal basin was often deemed sufficient. This casual approach to personal hygiene meant that the natural flora of the skin, a complex ecosystem of bacteria, fungi, and viruses, was frequently transferred to the food being prepared. Even the most visually appealing dish, glistening under the candlelight of a feasting hall, could harbor a silent infestation of microbes, invisible to the naked eye but potent in their ability to cause illness. The journey of a piece of meat from its raw state to its plated presentation was a particular minefield. Butchering was a messy business, involving the handling of orioles, blood, and bone. Cooks would often manage these tasks with the same tools and on the same surfaces as they would later use for chopping herbs or preparing sauces. The lingering bacteria from raw meat, particularly from poultry or pork, could easily find their way into cooked dishes if cross contamination occurred. Imagine a cook preparing a Sunday roast, meticulously carving the joint after it had emerged from the oven, its juices tempting and aromatic. If, earlier that day, that same knife had been used to prepare raw giblets without proper cleansing, the residual pathogens could be transferred to the perfectly cooked meat, creating a seemingly innocuous piece of food that was in reality a ticking time bomb of E. coli or salmonella. The very methods of food preservation, while ingenious for their time, also presented opportunities for contamination. Salting, for instance, was effective but often involved handling the salt itself, which could have been stored in less than ideal conditions. Drying, while removing moisture, could still leave food susceptible to mold if not done in completely sterile environments. And pickling, often a way to extend the life of vegetables and meats, relied on the quality of the brine and the vessels used. A cracked barrel or an improperly sealed jar could allow airborne contaminants to enter or encourage the growth of undesirable bacteria within the preserved food. The preparation of sauces and broths, often the crowning glory of a medieval dish, was another area where human touch and unhygienic practices could wreak havoc. A cook might gather herbs from a garden, brushing off dirt with their hands. They might then chop these herbs, their fingernails likely harboring a collection of unseen detritus. These ingredients would then be added to a simmering pot, the heat of which was not always sufficient to kill all forms of bacteria or their toxins. The rich, slow cooked stews and gravies, beloved for their depth of flavor, were also ideal breeding grounds for any pathogens that managed to infiltrate them during their extended cooking time. Beyond the individual cook, the communal nature of medieval kitchens also played a role. Food was often prepared in large batches, meant to serve many. If one cook had a minor ailment, such as a cold or a stomach upset, their exhalations or touch could contaminate a large quantity of food. Similarly, the sharing of utensils, cutting boards, and even serving platters without adequate washing between uses was commonplace. A wooden spoon, used to stir a pot of gruel, might then be used to taste a rich pottage, and then left to rest on a counter, awaiting its next task, all the while accumulating and distributing a microbial population. The availability of ingredients also played a part. While some kitchens might have had access to cleaner water sources or more carefully managed larders, many relied on whatever was available. Vegetables might be washed in river water that was also used for waste disposal. Meat might come from animals that were not inspected for disease, and foraged ingredients, such as berries or mushrooms, were subject to the same risks of misidentification and contamination from soil and animal waste as discussed previously, but with the added layer of human handling in their collection and preparation. The social structure of the kitchen also contributed to the problem. Kitchen staff were often drawn from lower social strata, and while many were diligent, the emphasis on speed and volume of production could sometimes override concerns about meticulous cleanliness. A scullery maid might be tasked with washing dishes, but perhaps without access to boiling water or proper drying cloths. The result was that plates and bowls, while appearing clean, could still harbor microscopic remnants of previous meals, ready to be reintroduced into the cycle of food preparation. Even the very act of tasting, a crucial step in ensuring the quality of a dish, could be a vector for contamination. A cook using a finger or a spoon to sample a sauce and then immediately returning to stir the pot was an open invitation for bacteria to spread. While the intent was to refine the flavor, the execution was a tacit acceptance of a potential health hazard. The sensory experience of medieval dining, therefore, was often a compromise between the pursuit of exquisite taste and the unfortunate reality of unhygienic practices. The seemingly innocuous act of peeling fruit or vegetables could also be a source of contamination. If the knife used for peeling had not been properly cleaned, it could transfer bacteria from its blade to the newly exposed flesh of the produce. This was particularly problematic for fruits and vegetables that were eaten raw, as there was no subsequent cooking step to eliminate any introduced pathogens. A beautifully presented salad, its vibrant colors a testament to the freshness of its ingredients, could nonetheless be a vehicle for illness if the produce was handled with unwashed hands or cut with contaminated utensils. The prevalence of insects and vermin in medieval kitchens, while perhaps a separate topic, also cannot be entirely disentangled from the issue of hygiene and the human element. Rodents and flies are notorious carriers of disease, and their presence in a food preparation area, however much it might have been tolerated by the standards of the time, was an additional source of contamination. The very air in a busy kitchen, thick with the aromas of cooking food, could also carry airborne bacteria and mold spores. The more these were disturbed by the constant movement of people and the opening and closing of doors, the greater the potential for them to settle onto exposed food. In essence, the medieval kitchen was a microcosm of a society that had not yet developed a sophisticated understanding of germ theory. The human touch, an unavoidable element in the creation of every meal, was also an accidental partner in the transmission of disease. The cook's hands, capable of transforming raw ingredients into delightful fare, were also conduits for invisible enemies. This unseen ingredient, the consequence of a less enlightened approach to personal and environmental hygiene, lurked within every dish, a constant, often unrecognized threat to the well being of those who gathered to partake in the sustenance of life. The efforts to create a feast were thus a double edged sword. The very hands that toiled to bring pleasure and nourishment were also, inadvertently, laying the groundwork for illness. The medieval palate, a remarkably resilient organ, accustomed to the jarring extremes of the banquet table, was nevertheless capable of staging its own dramatic rebellions. While the immediate dangers of a poorly cooked morsel or an improperly preserved ingredient might be swift and brutal, The lingering aftermath of a truly excessive repast could be a drawn out, deeply personal agony. The very richness and complexity of medieval cuisine, a testament to the culinary arts of the era, often masked a hidden potential for digestive devastation. Foods were not merely eaten, they were conquered, and for the unfortunate warrior or noble who overindulged, the battlefield of the stomach could prove far more treacherous than any field of combat. Consider the common knight, honored for his prowess in jousting and battlefield bravery. He might find his true adversary residing within his own midsection after a particularly lavish state dinner. The night might begin with a succession of heavy, gamey meats boar, venison, perhaps even swan or peacock, each roasted to a succulent, fatty perfection, but demanding a Herculean digestive effort. These were often followed by dense, fruit filled pies, their pastry thick enough to serve as a rudimentary shield, and their fillings a syrupy, often spiced medley that coated the tongue and the stomach lining with a saccharine film. And then, of course, came the beverages, ale, brewed in vast quantities and consumed with an almost ritualistic fervor, or mead, the potent honey wine, flowed freely. These potent concoctions, while lubricating the social interactions and dulling the senses to the less savory aspects of the feast, were also fermenting agents of potential internal chaos. The common ailment, one whispered about in hushed tones or suffered with a grimace, was what we might today term profound indigestion. But in the medieval context, this was no mere passing discomfort. It was a visceral upheaval, a rebellion of the gut against the sheer, unadulterated volume and richness it was forced to contend with. The stomach, overwhelmed by the sheer mass of food, would churn and gurgle, its natural processes struggling to break down the recalcitrant fats and complex carbohydrates. This would often manifest as a crippling bloating, an internal pressure that could feel as if one were hosting a small, unruly dragon within their abdomen. The resulting gas, a byproduct of this internal ferment, was often expelled with a series of resonant, and for the unfortunate sufferer, deeply embarrassing audible emissions. These were not the polite, apologetic puffs that might be barely perceptible today. These were declarations of internal distress, announcing to the entire hall that the knight's digestive fortitude had been found wanting. Beyond the simple bloat, more insidious consequences could arise. The rich, often heavily spiced, gravies and sauces, while adding layers of flavor, could also act as powerful irritants to an already taxed digestive tract. Ingredients like ginger, pepper, and cloves, valued for their exoticism and perceived medicinal properties, were also known to stimulate the production of gastric juices, further exacerbating the feeling of burning and discomfort. A medieval physician, were he to be consulted, might prescribe a poultice of herbs or a draught of a bitter tonic, but often the only true cure was time and a period of strict dietary abstinence, a prospect often met with considerable resistance after a successful feast. The interplay between food and drink was particularly perilous. The carbonation in certain ales, combined with the sugars in the mead or wine, could create a fizzy, effervescent storm within the stomach. This amplified the bloating and could lead to a condition sometimes described as windy distension, where the abdomen would swell to alarming proportions. Imagine a nobleman, his velvet doublet straining at the seams, his face flushed not with pleasure, but with the sheer physical pressure of undigested sustenance. The discomfort could be so profound that it interfered with sleep, leading to restless nights punctuated by agonizing cramps and a persistent feeling of nausea. Furthermore, the lack of modern understanding regarding food combinations meant that truly egregious pairings were not uncommon. Meats were often served with rich, creamy sauces, followed by heavily sweetened fruit compotes or custards. The digestive enzymes required to break down these disparate elements, proteins, fats, and sugars, operate at different rates and in different conditions. When forced to work in concert on such a varied and challenging load, they could falter. The result was a system thrown into disarray, leading to a backlog of undigested material, fermentation, and the release of gases that could cause significant distress. The sensation was often described as a heavy stomach, a leaden weight that resisted all attempts at comfortable positioning. The medieval concept of humors also informed how these digestive disturbances were understood. An imbalance of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was believed to be the root of most ailments. A digestive catastrophe following a feast might be attributed to an excess of yellow bile, leading to a hot and fiery discomfort, or perhaps a phlegmatic overload, causing a sense of sluggishness and internal dampness. Treatments would then be devised to rebalance these humors, often involving purgatives, emetics, or bloodletting. Measures that, in their own right, could leave the patient feeling even more depleted. The very texture of medieval food could contribute to these digestive woes. The frequent use of finely ground flours for bread and pies, while indicative of a certain level of refinement, could also create dense, pasty masses in the stomach. Thickened sauces, often achieved with ground almonds or stale breadcrumbs, added to this textural challenge. These substances, when mixed with the juices of rich meats and sweet fruits, could coalesce into a thick, viscous bolus that was difficult for the stomach to process efficiently. The slower the digestion, the longer the period of discomfort, and the greater the opportunity for fermentation and gas production. The social pressure to eat and drink heartily at feasts also played a significant role. Refusing a second or third helping, or limiting one's intake of wine, could be seen as an insult to the host or a sign of weakness. Knights and nobles, trained to display fortitude and excess in all aspects of life, were particularly susceptible to these pressures. The desire to appear magnanimous and appreciative often trumped the body's signals of satiety, leading to the inevitable digestive reckoning. A chivalrous knight might endure a painful wound with stoicism, but he might also find himself reduced to a whimpering, gas-filled shadow of his former self by a poorly timed indulgence in spiced goose liver. Consider the chronicler's account of a royal banquet. While the written record might focus on the splendor of the attire, the melodies of the minstrels, and the pronouncements of the monarch, the unspoken reality for many attendees was the slow, agonizing progression of digestive distress. The initial euphoria of abundance would gradually give way to a mounting discomfort. The polite clearing of throats might mask the internal gurgling. The forced smiles could conceal the grimaces of stomach cramps. By the time the loyal subjects were departing, or seeking a place to rest their afflicted bodies, the true price of such opulence would be starkly apparent. The reliance on animal fats, rendered and used liberally in cooking, was another significant contributor. Lards, butter, and drippings from roasted meats were not just ingredients, they were the very medium through which flavor was conveyed. These fats, while adding succulence, are notoriously difficult for the digestive system to break down, especially in the large quantities consumed. The result could be a feeling of greasy fullness, a sensation that the stomach was lined with a layer of semi solid fat, impeding the passage of other food and prolonging the entire digestive process. This could lead to periods of prolonged nausea, where the mere thought of food would trigger a wave of discomfort. Even the preparation of certain digestive aids could prove problematic. While herbal infusions and spiced cordials were sometimes offered to assist digestion, their efficacy was questionable, and their preparation could also introduce new challenges. Some tonics were brewed with strong, acrid herbs or distilled spirits that could in themselves irritate the stomach lining. The intention might be to stimulate the bowels or expel excess wind, but the outcome could be a violent purging or an intensification of the initial discomfort. The communal nature of feasting, where dishes were often passed around and served from large platters, also meant that the lingering effects of one person's overindulgence could be felt by others. If a host, or a particularly hearty eater, at the head of the table began to experience significant digestive distress, the atmosphere could become palpably uncomfortable. The sounds, the smells, and the general air of discomfort could spread, creating a shared experience of gastrointestinal misery. The sheer monotony of certain dietary elements in medieval times, punctuated by the extreme excess of feasts, may have also played a role. When the daily diet consisted of relatively plain gruels, pottages, and coarse bread, the sudden influx of rich, fatty, and heavily spiced foods at a banquet could shock the system. The digestive tract, accustomed to a simpler workload, was ill prepared for the onslaught of complex flavors and textures. This sudden transition from a low impact diet to a high impact one was a recipe for internal discord. The lack of easily accessible and palatable antacids or digestive aids meant that medieval individuals were largely left to their own devices when confronted with digestive distress. Unlike modern society, where a simple tablet can alleviate heartburn or a glass of mineral water can settle an upset stomach, medieval sufferers had to rely on home remedies, prayer, or the often dubious advice of itinerant healers. This lack of readily available relief meant that the agony of indigestion could be a prolonged and deeply unpleasant ordeal. The groans of discomfort, the clutching of the stomach, and the pallor of a face contorted with pain were common sights at the aftermath of any significant celebration. The feast, designed to be a moment of unadulterated pleasure, often ended with a quiet, personal battle against the consequences of one's own appetite. A battle that, in the medieval world, was frequently lost. The jovial atmosphere, thick with the aroma of roasted meats and the clinking of goblets, could pivot with startling abruptness. A flicker of strangeness would cross one face, then another. It might begin with a subtle tremor in a young serving wench, her hands, usually steady as she poured wine, now quivering. Then a seasoned knight, his face flushed with victory and ale, would find his limbs acting with a will of their own, his usually disciplined posture devolving into an erratic sway. The shift was as unsettling as it was swift. What had moments before been a symphony of satisfied murmurs and boisterous laughter would begin to unravel, replaced by a discordant percussion of stamping feet and gasping breaths. This was the terrifying arrival of the dancing plague, a bewildering affliction that seemed to sprout from the very soil of medieval revelry. It was a phenomenon that defied rational explanation, a collective loss of control that transformed a celebration into a spectacle of involuntary, almost demonic choreography. Picture the scene: a lord, mid anecdote, his hand raised in emphasis, suddenly jolted into a jig, his ornate robes swirling around him as if caught in a phantom wind. His wife, attempting to regain composure, might find herself mirroring his wild contortions, her delicate slippers tapping an increasingly frantic rhythm against the flagstones. The contagion, if it could be called that, was not of a physical pathogen in the traditional sense. It was a psychological contagion, a wave of hysteria that swept through assemblies, compelling individuals to dance with an unbridled, ceaseless energy. Their eyes would gleam with a peculiar fervor, not of joy, but of a desperate, almost tormented compulsion. The movements were often uncoordinated, jerky, and exhausting, yet they were utterly irresistible to those afflicted. A duke, accustomed to dictating terms to armies, would find himself unable to resist the urge to flail his arms and kick his legs, his carefully cultivated dignity dissolving into a grotesque pantomime. Imagine the sheer disarray: a perfectly orchestrated banquet, with courses of rich foods arriving and departing with clockwork precision, would descend into utter chaos. Serving girls, still carrying platters of delicate pastries, would be forced to abandon their duties, their bodies betraying them with a sudden, violent lurch into a dance. Musicians, their instruments providing the soundtrack to the feast, might themselves be caught in the grip of this strange malady, their fingers flying across lutes and pipes with an uncharacteristic frenzy, or worse, dropping their instruments altogether as they too succumbed to the inexplicable urge. The very act of eating, a central purpose of the feast, became a dangerous proposition. How could one convey a morsel of succulent venison to one's mouth when one's arms were involuntarily thrown into the air? How could one sip wine without spilling it in a wild, uncontrolled gesture? The carefully laid tables, laden with the fruits of a prosperous harvest and the spoils of the hunt, would become obstacles, their contents scattered as dancers stumbled and gyrated, their movements increasingly desperate. The visual of a noblewoman, her face contorted in a rictus of exertion and bewildered terror, desperately trying to avoid knocking over a crystal goblet, only to be seized by another spasm of the dancing malady, would have been a common, chilling sight. This wasn't a dance of celebration, of light-hearted merriment. It was a dance of desperation, a physical manifestation of an internal torment that seemed to possess no clear origin. The dancers were not in control. They were vessels for an unseen force. Their limbs would ache, their lungs would burn, and their minds would reel, yet the dancing would continue. The sweat would pour down their faces, mingling with tears of exhaustion and confusion. Their once fine garments would become disheveled, clinging to their sweat-drenched bodies as they spun and hopped, their steps leaving an ever-increasing imprint of disruption upon the otherwise stately proceedings. The social order, so rigidly maintained in these assemblies, would be utterly shattered. The king or queen, the host of such a grand affair, might be among the first to succumb, their regal authority momentarily suspended by the tyrannical grip of this dancing fever. Who could maintain decorum when their own body betrayed them with such a public and undignified display? The carefully constructed hierarchies, the deference owed to rank, all would be momentarily forgotten as individuals from the highest nobility to the lowest scullery maid were united by this shared, involuntary ordeal. The sounds of the feast would change. The initial murmurs of conversation would be drowned out by the rhythmic pounding of feet, the gasps for air, and the occasional cries of alarm or distress from those watching. The cheerful melodies of the minstrels would be either abandoned or distorted into a frenzied, desperate tempo that mirrored the dancer's own uncontrollable exertions. It was a sonic landscape of escalating pandemonium where the joyous sounds of celebration mutated into a cacophony of exertion and terror. The dancers themselves would often exhibit a trance like state, their gazes distant, their focus entirely inward, or perhaps on some imagined specter driving their movements. They would not, or could not, respond to those who tried to help them, their bodies too consumed by the relentless rhythm of the dance. Attempts to restrain them would often be met with surprising strength, fueled by the desperate energy of the affliction, or sometimes with a complete lack of reaction, as if their consciousness had retreated, leaving their bodies to perform this involuntary ballet of agony. The historical accounts, though often steeped in a desire to explain the inexplicable, paint a picture of utter bewilderment. Was it a curse, a divine punishment, a demonic possession? The inability to pinpoint a cause only amplified the fear. The medieval mind, so accustomed to seeking supernatural explanations for the unusual, found itself confronted with a phenomenon that seemed to defy even those established frameworks. It was a tangible, visible madness, a breakdown of the very fabric of reasoned human behavior played out on the grand stage of a celebratory feast. The sheer endurance required was staggering. These were not short bursts of energetic movement. The plague, in its most severe manifestations, could compel individuals to dance for days on end, their bodies eventually succumbing to sheer exhaustion, dehydration, or organ failure. Imagine the horror of witnessing a loved one, or even a respected acquaintance, driven to such extremes, their flesh tearing from their shoes, their skin raw and bleeding, yet still unable to cease the relentless, agonizing motion. The festive hall, once a symbol of abundance and communal joy, would transform into a scene of collective suffering, a testament to the fragility of human control over both external circumstances and internal impulses. The implications for the feasting itself were profound. Such an event, designed to foster goodwill, strengthen alliances, and celebrate achievements, could be irrevocably tainted by the specter of mass hysteria. The memories of such a feast would not be of the delicious food or the witty conversation, but of the terrifying disembodied dancing, the expressions of abject misery etched onto the faces of the participants, and the unsettling silence that would eventually fall when the exhausted, afflicted bodies finally ceased their involuntary movements. The feast, intended as a triumph of human sustenance and social order, would instead become a stark reminder of the capricious and often terrifying forces that could undermine them. The carefully constructed facade of civilization would crack, revealing the primal anxieties and inexplicable susceptibilities that lay just beneath the surface, waiting for the right, or indeed the wrong, circumstances to erupt. The precariousness of attending a medieval feast was not merely a matter of social etiquette or the potential for a poisoned chalice, though both were certainly considerations. It was more fundamentally a test of one's ability to navigate a constantly shifting landscape of potential bodily harm. For the discerning, or perhaps merely the perpetually anxious, individual, survival was an art form, a delicate dance of avoidance that mirrored in its own way the more involuntary performances that could plague such gatherings. Our observant protagonist, perhaps a scribe burdened with documenting the proceedings, with a quill that trembled more from apprehension than inspiration, or a squire whose primary duty was to keep his master from imbibing too much or offending the wrong duke, quickly realized that passive presence was a recipe for disaster. The first and most crucial skill was the art of observation, a constant, almost predatory vigilance. While others might be caught up in the boisterous tales of valor, the exaggerated claims of hunting prowess, or the saccharine flattery directed towards the host, our keen eyed survivors scanned the periphery. They noted the serving wench, whose smile seemed a touch too fixed, the cook who lingered a moment too long by the roasting boar, the individual whose eyes darted nervously towards the door. These were not necessarily indicators of immediate peril, but rather subtle whispers in the cacophony of the feast, clues to the underlying currents of potential catastrophe. A spilled goblet, a dropped plate, a sudden gasp. These were not isolated incidents, but data points in the ongoing assessment of risk. The pragmatic individual learned to interpret the subtle shifts in body language, the almost imperceptible tension in the shoulders of a knight who had perhaps sampled too much of the host's notoriously potent mead, or the strained politeness of a baroness trying to fend off an overly amorous proposition. Then came the equally vital skill of polite refusal. This was not simply a matter of saying no, thank you. That was too direct, too likely to draw unwanted attention. Instead, it involved a masterful blend of feigned distraction and subtle deflection. If a platter of something suspiciously unidentifiable, perhaps a glistening tureen of indeterminate origin, or a mound of what appeared to be curdled cream garnished with brightly colored yet disturbingly unidentifiable berries, was offered, the response was not a direct rejection. Rather, it was a gentle yet firm placement of a hand over the offered morsel, accompanied by a murmured explanation. My deepest apologies, kind sir, the scribe might say, his voice laced with earnest regret. But I believe I have already partaken of sufficient delights. My patron insists I maintain a clear head for his dictation this evening. The squire might offer a deferential bow, his eyes fixed on the floor. My lord thanks you for your generosity, but my master requires me to remain exceptionally alert, and I fear even the slightest indulgence might dull my senses. The key was to make the refusal sound like a matter of duty or personal discipline, rather than a critique of the food or the provider. It was a way of saying no without making anyone feel rebuffed, a delicate tightrope walk over a chasm of potential offense. The communal goblet, that ubiquitous vessel, passed from hand to hand, often brimming with wine that could range from perfectly palatable to positively corrosive, was another significant hazard. To accept it directly was to invite whatever unseen maladies or subtle poisons it might carry. The practiced refuser would employ a variety of tactics. As the goblet approached, the scribe might subtly shift his position, turning his body as if to address a nearby guest, his hand casually reaching for his own, thankfully smaller and individually provided cup. The squire, ever the watchful guardian, might intercept the communal goblet with a practiced flick of his wrist, his own tankard already raised in a gesture of preemptive thirst. "A moment, good master," he might exclaim, his voice echoing with feigned joviality. "I must first ensure my lord has his own refreshment. He is most particular about his vintage." This not only deflected the communal offering, but also subtly reinforced his role as a diligent attendant, further deflecting personal scrutiny. More adventurous strategies involve the art of misdirection and the feigned infirmity. A strategically timed cough, a sudden exaggerated grimace as if struck by a passing cramp, could be enough to make the offer of a shared portion of dubious stew or a handful of suspiciously sticky sugared nuts a momentarily awkward proposition for the server. The goal was to create just enough of a distraction, just enough of a visual impediment, that the proffered item would bypass the survivor and move on to the next, less cautious participant. It was a fleeting window of opportunity, requiring the precise timing of a seasoned actor on stage, but often the reward, continued good health, was well worth the effort. The very act of eating, a supposed highlight of any feast, became a minefield of personal risk management. The principle of "see it before you eat it" was paramount. If a morsel was served from a communal dish, the survivor would wait, observing others, noting if any immediate ill effects followed their consumption. If a dish was presented with a particularly off putting smell or an unsettling texture, it was best left undisturbed. The pragmatic individual might discreetly use their napkin to mop up any errant drips or spills from their own plate, and then subtly transfer any particularly suspect remnants to the edge of their plate, to be discreetly disposed of later, or perhaps subtly nudged towards a conveniently placed dog under the table, if such a canine presence was tolerated. There was also the subtle art of portion control, not dictated by appetite, but by a grim assessment of safety. One might accept a small portion of a widely distributed dish, particularly if it was something that had been heated thoroughly and was being served in a manner that minimized handling. However, anything that looked overly rich, overly processed, or suspiciously vibrant in color was approached with extreme caution. A tiny sliver of roasted fowl, a single kernel of spiced nut. These were often the extent of one's indulgence, ensuring that if the worst did occur, the impact would be minimized. This was not about enjoying the feast, it was about surviving it, with one's digestive system intact. The proximity to others also posed a unique challenge. In the crush of a crowded hall, it was inevitable that elbows would jostle, bodies would press together, and the risk of accidental ingestion of something undesirable, be it a rogue pea from a neighbor's plate or a stray strand of someone's hair, increased exponentially. The survivor learned to maintain a small, personal perimeter, a subtle shifting of weight and angle that allowed for a degree of separation without appearing antisocial. A carefully placed hand on the table's edge, a slight pivot of the torso, could create just enough space to avoid an unwanted culinary exchange. Furthermore, understanding the host and the nature of the feast itself was paramount. Was this a celebration of a successful harvest, likely to feature wholesome, if perhaps bland, fare? Or was it a victory banquet, where the food might be more exotic, more experimental, and thus potentially more perilous? A host known for his lavish but often carelessly prepared banquets required a far greater degree of vigilance than one known for his meticulous, albeit less exciting, culinary standards. Knowledge, as it so often did in the medieval world, was indeed power, and in the context of a feast, it was the power to avoid a potentially agonizing demise. The sheer theatricality of the feast also provided opportunities for the astute observer. A lord, in the midst of a particularly impassioned speech, might gesture wildly, sending wine splashing across the table. A lady, startled by a sudden clap of thunder or the sudden appearance of a court jester, might drop her pastry, its creamy filling splattering onto the flagstones. These moments of disruption, while potentially chaotic, also created openings. The survivor could use these as opportunities to subtly rearrange their surroundings, to move their plate away from a precarious edge, or to discreetly dispose of any unwanted food items under the cover of the general commotion. It was about seeing the chaos not as a threat, but as an ally. The act of drinking, as much a part of feasting as eating, was equally fraught with peril. Beyond the communal goblet, there were the individual cups, often made of pewter or horn, which could retain lingering tastes and odors, or worse, harbor unseen impurities. The wise attendee would observe how the wine was poured, noting any hesitation or unusual muddiness from the server. If the wine itself had a strange color, a peculiar fizz, or an unpleasantly sharp aroma, it was best to nurse one's own cup slowly, or to claim a sudden and overwhelming thirst that required a lengthy absence from the table, perhaps to the privy, where one might discreetly empty the offending liquid. The excuse of a delicate constitution or a sensitive stomach was a valuable tool in the arsenal of the feast-goer. Indeed, the entire experience was a masterclass in controlled engagement. It was about being present, acknowledging the social contract of the feast, but doing so with a carefully calibrated detachment. It was about participating in the conversation without offering too much of one's own opinion, nodding at the appropriate moments, and smiling at the right cues, all while keeping a vigilant eye on the potential threats that lurked in every dish and every goblet. The goal was not to be the life of the party, but to be the one who left the party when it was finally over, in a state of perfect health and unblemished dignity. The art of the evasive maneuver was not about cowardice. It was about a profound, practical wisdom, a deep understanding of the potential dangers of unchecked indulgence, and a quiet, determined commitment to survival in a world where even the most joyous occasions could harbor hidden perils. It was a testament to the human capacity for adaptation, for finding ways to thrive, or at least endure, in environments that were often more hostile than they appeared. The raw, visceral reality of a medieval feast was a tapestry woven with threads of both forced merriment and latent danger. It was a stage where the performance of civility often masked a deeper, more primal struggle for self-preservation. Amidst the boisterous pronouncements, the clatter of trenchers, and the pervasive scent of roasted meats mingled with unwashed bodies, our discerning observer found themselves not entirely alone in their quiet vigilance. There were others, a silent fraternity of the wary, whose watchful eyes mirrored their own, whose subtle gestures spoke volumes in the deafening din. These were the unacknowledged allies, the fellow travelers on the perilous path through the gastronomic gauntlet, bound not by spoken word, but by the shared recognition of a precarious predicament. It began with a look, a mere flicker of the eyes, a fleeting contraction of the brow, as a particularly enthusiastic diner, perhaps emboldened by several flagons of ale, sent a projectile piece of roasted fowl careening across the hall. The intended target, a portly merchant, managed to duck just in time, but the trajectory carried the airborne poultry perilously close to another guest. This other guest, a surprisingly composed woman seated with a quiet dignity that belied the surrounding pandemonium, instinctively flinched, her hand rising to shield her face. In that split second, our observer, who had already noted her meticulous avoidance of the communal gravy boat and her subtle yet firm refusal of the suspiciously gelatinous stew, met her gaze. It was a brief, almost imperceptible exchange, a shared acknowledgment of the near miss, a silent recognition of the inherent lunacy of the proceedings. There was no smile, no overt gesture, just a mutual understanding that resonated in the shared experience of narrowly averting a poultry based assault. It was a tiny spark of connection ignited in the furnace of potential disaster. Then there was the matter of the wandering leech merchant. In certain circles, particularly those attended by ecclesiastics or individuals prone to a robust, if unbalanced, bloodletting regimen, such a vendor might make an appearance. Imagine, if you will, a stooped figure, his tray laden with small, damp cloths, each cradling a plump, wriggling leech. He'd sidle through the throng, his wares a stark contrast to the glittering goblets and overflowing platters. Most attendees would avert their eyes, some with a shudder of disgust, others with a passing curiosity. But for those who understood the precarious balance of medieval health, the very presence of such a purveyor was a subtle red flag, a harbinger of discussions about humors and imbalances that might lead to a patron themselves becoming a target for such treatments. Our observer noticed a particular knight, a man of formidable bearing who had thus far expertly navigated the treacherous currents of the feast, subtly shift his weight as the leech man approached. The knight's hand, as if by accident, found its way to the hilt of his sword, not in aggression, but in a gesture that seemed to convey a firm, unspoken, "I am quite well, thank you, and have no need of your aquatic companions." The observer, witnessing this quiet, almost imperceptible act of defiance against the specter of medieval medicine, felt a kinship. It was a silent declaration. We are of the same ilk, those who prefer the plague to the lancet. The shared scowl, it was the most potent, yet the most understated of the bonds forged in the crucible of the feast. It wasn't a scowl of anger or disdain, but a scowl of profound, weary recognition. Picture this: the Baron, a man whose girth seemed to expand with every passing hour and whose pronouncements grew ever more nonsensical with the increasing consumption of wine, decides it is an opportune moment to share a particularly lengthy and embellished anecdote about his prowess in a falconry competition that by all accounts he did not even attend. As he begins his convoluted tale, his voice booming and laced with the unmistakable slurring of overindulgence, he punctuates his narrative with a series of vigorous, spittle-flecked gestures. One such gesture, a sweeping arc of his arm, sends a cascade of gravy from his trencher flying across the table. It lands with an audible splat on the pristine white tunic of a young scribe whose sole crime was being seated too close to the Baron's ill-disciplined elbow. The scribe, a young man whose brow was already furrowed with the effort of deciphering the Baron's increasingly incoherent pronouncements, visibly recoils. Peace, his expression contorts, not in outrage, but in a deep, soul weary resignation. It's the look of a man who has seen it all before, who knows that such indignities are not exceptions, but the rule. At that precise moment, a few tables away, our observer, who had been meticulously examining the structural integrity of a nearby gargoyle, catches the scribe's eye, and there it is, the shared scowl, a silent, perfectly synchronized grimace that says, "Yes, this is precisely what we expected, and it is utterly ridiculous." This momentary connection, forged in the shared understanding of the Baron's boorishness and the scribe's unfortunate baptism by gravy, was a brief respite from the isolation of individual survival. These moments were fleeting, often occurring amidst the cacophony and the visual overload. They were the glint of steel in a shadowed corner, the knowing wink exchanged between two individuals who had both successfully deflected the overtures of a particularly persistent troubadour. Consider the dessert course, often a perilous descent into sugar induced delirium. One particularly ambitious confection, a towering edifice of spun sugar, candied fruits, and something that resembled solidified custard, was being presented. As the head server, a man whose apron bore the stains of countless culinary skirmishes, attempted to carve a portion, the entire structure wobbled precariously. It leaned, it swayed, and then, with a groan of collapsing sweetness, it tipped. A cascade of syrupy goo and candied cherries rained down upon the assembled diners. While many yelped and scrambled, one individual, a woman whose composure had been remarkable throughout the evening, managed to catch a rogue candied plum on her napkin with an almost surgical precision. She then, with a practiced, almost disdainful flick of her wrist, tossed it into a nearby brazier, where it hissed and vanished in a puff of sugary smoke. Our observer, who had opted for a single carefully selected dried fig, saw this act of culinary euthanasia. Their eyes met across the smoky haze of the hall, a subtle nod, a shared understanding of the inherent barbarity of such over the top and ultimately unsafe gastronomic displays. It was a silent pact. We see the folly, we will not be consumed by it. The presence of certain individuals, whose reputation preceded them like a foul odor, also served to forge these unspoken alliances. Take, for instance, Brother Thomas, a monk known for his fervent belief in the efficacy of bloodletting and his habit of carrying a small pouch of leeches, which he offered liberally to any he deemed afflicted with an imbalance of humors. His pronouncements on the benefits of purging and sweating were often delivered with an evangelical zeal that could curdle even the most robust wine. As Brother Thomas approached the table where our observer was seated, his gaze fell upon a man whose robust laughter had been echoing through the hall. Brother Thomas, ever the opportunist, leaned in, his voice a low conspiratorial murmur, and began to extol the virtues of a good venesection. The man, whose face was still red from his mirth, suddenly paled. He managed a weak smile, his eyes darting towards the exit. It was at this precise moment that our observer, having meticulously ensured their own goblet, remained untouched by the communal serving ladle, caught the eye of another guest across the hall. This other guest, a woman who had been subtly but firmly refusing Brother Thomas's earlier advances, offered an almost imperceptible shake of her head. Their shared glance was a silent communication. He's at it again. We are, thankfully, beyond his reach. It was a moment of solidarity in the face of unsolicited and potentially hazardous medical advice. The shared scowl, the knowing glance, the subtle nod, these were the silent language of survival. They were the affirmations that one was not alone in recognizing the absurdities and the dangers that permeated the very fabric of the medieval feast. It was a recognition that beneath the veneer of feasting and revelry lay a primal instinct for self preservation, and that those who possessed this instinct, who could see through the grand spectacle to the inherent perils, formed an invisible yet powerful community. This camaraderie, forged in the silent acknowledgement of shared vigilance, was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a quiet rebellion against the chaotic and often life threatening excesses of the age. It was the understanding that in a world where a misplaced elbow could lead to indigestion and an ill timed word could lead to a duel, the greatest strength often lay in the unspoken solidarity of those who simply wished to survive the night with their health and their dignity intact. It was the quiet acknowledgement that in the grand, grotesque theater of the feast, even a shared scowl could be a lifeline. The very act of eating, usually a communal bonding experience, became a solitary ordeal of calculated risk assessment, and even in this isolation, connections could be forged. Consider the notorious mystery pie, a staple at many a grand feast, its contents a subject of much speculation and often dread. This particular evening, the pie in question was a behemoth, its crust a deep, unappetizing brown, and its aroma a complex, almost challenging medley of spices that hinted at ingredients best left unidentified. As the Baron, with his customary lack of decorum, plunged a dagger into its heart, a cloud of steam, pungent and vaguely alarming, billowed forth. Most guests, either out of politeness or sheer terror, accepted a sliver, but there were a select few who did not. Our observer, having already opted for a safer, if less exciting, portion of roasted capon, noticed a young woman at a nearby table. She had a look of profound apprehension on her face as the serving wench approached with a generous portion of the mystery pie. The wench, oblivious to the potential gastronomic horrors contained within, placed a heaping spoonful onto the young woman's trencher. The woman's eyes widened slightly, her lips pressed together in a thin line. Just as she was about to reluctantly raise her fork, our observer, in a move that was both daring and perfectly timed, let out a sudden, almost theatrical cough. It was a well placed, attention grabbing cough that caused the serving wench to momentarily look away. In that fleeting instant, the young woman, with a swift, almost imperceptible movement, managed to tip her trencher slightly, allowing the bulk of the mystery pie to slide discreetly onto a conveniently placed dog's eager tongue beneath the table. Her eyes met our observers, and in that shared glance, a silent understanding passed between them, a mutual appreciation for a well executed act of culinary evasion. It was a moment of shared triumph over the tyranny of the mystery pie. The communal goblet, that ubiquitous symbol of shared revelry, often harbored its own subtle threats. Wine, frequently watered down or of questionable origin, was passed from hand to hand, a vector for more than just intoxication. Our observer, having wisely fortified themselves with their own personal, smaller cup of wine, watched as the large, ornate goblet made its rounds. They noticed a particular nobleman, a man whose reputation for being excessively diplomatic was only surpassed by his reputation for having a rather delicate constitution, receive the goblet. He took a small, almost apologetic sip, his expression carefully neutral. As he passed it to the next guest, our observer saw him subtly wipe the rim with his thumb, a barely noticeable gesture. Later, as the same nobleman politely declined a second offer from the goblet, he offered a slight, apologetic smile. Our observer, who had also declined the communal offering, caught the eye of a lady seated across the hall. She too had refused the goblet, and her gaze met our observer's with a knowing glint. It was a silent acknowledgment of their shared aversion to the communal chalice, a recognition that sometimes the most civilized act was to refuse to participate in the perceived camaraderie. Even the most innocent seeming moments could betray underlying perils, and it was in the recognition of these subtle dangers that these fleeting alliances were formed. Consider the jester, a figure meant to bring levity. His antics could, in the wrong context, become a source of considerable anxiety. During one particularly raucous segment of the feast, the jester, a man known for his elaborate costumes and his penchant for prop comedy, produced a live chicken. His intention was to engage in a comedic chase, much to the delight of the younger guests. However, as he launched the fowl into the air, its wings flailing in bewildered panic, it veered off course, narrowly missing the Duke's elaborate feathered hat. The Duke, a man of volatile temper, roared in displeasure, his face turning a shade of puce that suggested an imminent and potentially violent outburst. Our observer, who had been meticulously ensuring their own plate remained free of stray chicken feathers, saw the Duke's furious glare. Across the hall, a lady of the court, whose face had momentarily contorted in alarm at the chicken's aerial assault, offered a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. Her eyes met our observers, and in that shared moment of recognizing the Duke's perilous temper and the jester's reckless abandon, there was a silent communion. It was a shared understanding that the jester's attempt at humor had nearly plunged the feast into a diplomatic incident, and that a shared vigilance was the only true safeguard against the unpredictable nature of such gatherings. These instances, though seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme of a medieval banquet, were the threads that wove a subtle network of understanding among those who navigated the feast with a keen and often anxious eye. They were the moments that transformed a room full of strangers, all ostensibly enjoying themselves, into a collection of individuals who for a fleeting instant recognized a shared spirit of survival. It was the silent acknowledgement that beneath the surface of forced merriment and elaborate displays of wealth, there was a common understanding of the potential for mishap, for discomfort, and even for genuine danger. These were not overt acts of friendship, but rather the subtle, unspoken recognition of a shared experience, a mutual understanding that in the chaotic symphony of the medieval feast, a discerning observer was not a solitary figure, but one of a quiet, watchful fellowship. The shared scowl, the discreet cough, the nearly invisible nod, these were the quiet affirmations that one was not alone in their pursuit of a safe and uneventful evening, even in the heart of what was ostensibly a celebration. They were the small, yet significant glimmers of human connection in a world that often celebrated excess at the expense of well-being. The gluttony, the sheer, unadulterated more of it all was beginning to cloy. It wasn't just the lingering scent of roasted boar, heavy and cloying like a damp wool blanket, or the sight of a duke quite literally rolling on the floor, his doublet unbuttoned, his face a florid testament to his triumph over sobriety. It was the subtle shift in the atmosphere, a palpable descent from boisterous revelry into something more akin to a chaotic, uncontrolled conflagration of senses. The music, once a lively jig that might encourage a hesitant foot tap, had devolved into a frenzied, repetitive drone, punctuated by the occasional clang of a dropped goblet and the unmistakable sound of someone retching. The air, thick with the exhalations of 100 bodies swimming in their own perspiration and the fumes of cheap wine, felt heavy, oppressive. It was the moment when the wise, or perhaps the merely sensible, began to calculate their exit. For our discerning observer, this calculation had been a constant background hum throughout the evening. It was a quiet assessment of diminishing returns, a weighing of potential discomforts against the dwindling allure of the spectacle. The initial novelty, the raw, untamed energy of the feast, had long since been eclipsed by a growing awareness of the inherent fragility of it all. The communal trenchers, once a source of shared sustenance, now seemed like potential minefields, their surfaces gleaming with the greasy residue of countless hands and dubious utensils. The wine, passed from goblet to goblet, had long lost its initial charm, its potency now suspect, its origins murkier than a bog at midnight. Every dropped morsel, every unseemly belch, every overly familiar slap on the back served as another data point in the ongoing assessment. Was the reward for staying still worth the escalating risk of contagion, indignity, or heaven forbid, accidental ingestion of something truly abominable? The decision, when it finally solidified, was less a grand pronouncement and more a quiet, internal surrender to the inevitable. It was the realization that enough was, in fact, enough. The feast, in its relentless pursuit of excess, had effectively consumed its own tail, leaving behind only the hollow echo of its initial promise. The true victory, it seemed, lay not in enduring the entirety of this medieval marathon, but in knowing when to gracefully, or perhaps more accurately, stealthily withdraw. This was not cowardice, it was a strategic withdrawal, a recognition that the true spoils of such an event were not to be found in the lingering remnants of the banquet, but in the preservation of one's own well being, and dare one say, dignity. The act of departure itself was an art form, honed through countless similar experiences, perhaps even from earlier, less elaborate attempts at survival. It required a delicate balance of invisibility and subtle influence. One could not simply stand up and announce their intention to leave. Such an act would undoubtedly draw attention, perhaps even an unwelcome inquiry from a host who viewed any departure before the final, lamentable strains of music as a personal affront. No, the exit had to be organic, a natural fading into the background, like a shadow lengthening as the firelight dimmed. The first step was to reduce one's visibility. This meant a subtle repositioning, a gradual migration from the center of the action towards the periphery of the hall. It involved strategically placing oneself behind a particularly robust pillar or in the temporary shadow cast by a gusty draft from an ill fitting window. It was about becoming less of a participant and more of an observer of the observers, a ghost in the machine of revelry. Each shift in seating was a calculated move, a step further away from the epicenter of the chaos, a gentle disengagement from the escalating absurdity. Next came the feigned engagement. One might offer a brief, apologetic smile to a fellow diner who attempted to draw them into a renewed bout of drinking, a subtle shake of the head that conveyed a well intentioned but ultimately insurmountable fatigue. It was about projecting an air of quiet contentment with one's current state, a silent declaration that the cup, metaphorically speaking, had been sufficiently drained. This also involved mastering the art of the polite refusal. When a serving wench, her face flushed and her movements increasingly clumsy, offered another plate of something unidentifiable and disturbingly gelatinous, a gentle but firm, "Nay, good wench, I am replete," was often sufficient. The key was to deliver these refusals with a tone that suggested a satisfied fullness rather than a desperate aversion. The proximity to an exit became a crucial factor. The large oak doors, which had initially seemed like mere portals to the revelry, now represented the promise of blessed silence and fresh air. The objective was to maneuver oneself into a position where these doors were not an insurmountable distance away, nor were they directly in the path of the most inebriated revelers. It was a dance of calculated proximity, a slow, deliberate sidestep towards the threshold of freedom. One of the most effective, albeit risky, maneuvers was the feigned interaction, catching the eye of a departing guest, perhaps someone also exhibiting signs of strategic retreat, and offering a brief, conspiratorial nod could be a subtle signal. It was a silent understanding. "You're leaving too? Excellent." This could provide a convenient diversion, a moment where attention was momentarily diverted from oneself towards the two figures briefly acknowledging each other. It also provided a potential, albeit unlikely, ally should one's exit be challenged. The actual act of rising from one's seat was the most delicate phase. It required a smooth, unhurried motion, avoiding any sudden movements that might attract undue attention. The goal was to appear as if one were merely stretching, perhaps adjusting their attire before a casual stroll towards the periphery. The cloak, that essential tool of discretion, was to be gathered with practiced ease, not flung on with an air of urgent escape. The objective was to appear as if one were simply seeking a moment of quiet contemplation outside the immediate din, a brief respite before rejoining the fray, a respite that, unbeknownst to the oblivious masses, would be permanent. As one approached the doors, the volume of conversation and the intensity of the revelry seemed to amplify, as if the very air itself was resisting the act of departure. The sounds of drunken singing, the splintering of wood from an overenthusiastic dance move, the occasional roar of laughter that bordered on hysteria, all served as a reminder of what was being left behind, and more importantly, what was being escaped. Stepping through the doors was like passing through a veil. The oppressive heat, the cloying scents, the deafening noise, all instantly receded, replaced by the cool night air and a profound, almost startling silence. The moon, a pale disk in the ink-black sky, seemed to cast a forgiving light upon the triumphant escapee. The ground beneath one's feet, no longer slick with spilled wine or questionable gravy, felt firm and blessedly stable. The journey back to one's own chambers, or perhaps a more discreet and less populated dwelling, was a solitary but deeply satisfying one. Each step away from the feasting hall was a reaffirmation of the decision. The distant echoes of the revelry served only to underscore the wisdom of the chosen path. It was the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished, a battle waged and won, not with swords or shields, but with observation and strategic evasion. The true feast, it turned out, was the quiet comfort of one's own undisturbed space, the knowledge that one had navigated the treacherous waters of medieval excess and emerged relatively unscathed, ready to face another day, perhaps with a slightly less enthusiastic appetite for large scale communal dining. The memories of the feast would, of course, remain, but they would be the memories of a successful, if somewhat grotesque, performance of survival, a testament to the quiet art of knowing when to say, enough. The hush of dawn, when it finally settled over the castle, was not the gentle caress of a new day, but rather a strained, almost gagging silence. It was the silence of a battlefield after the last clang of steel has faded, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the rustle of scavengers picking through the debris. For those who had thrown themselves headlong into the previous night's culinary carnage, the morning after was a stark, unforgiving mirror reflecting the consequences of their gluttony. The grand hall, once a riot of color, sound, and prodigious appetites, now resembled the aftermath of a particularly brutal food fight, albeit one involving the aristocracy and their unfortunate digestive systems. The air, which had been thick with the mingled perfumes of roast meats, spilled wine, and unwashed bodies, now carried a more pungent bouquet. It was a complex blend of souring ale, half-eaten dishes left to congeal on silver platters, and the undeniable miasma of human discomfort. Tongues felt like sandpaper, heads throbbed with a relentless drum-like rhythm, and stomachs churned with a chaotic symphony of indigestion. Some guests, those who had wisely, or perhaps simply by chance, moderated their intake, stirred with a sense of quiet triumph, their memories of the night intact, if a little hazy around the edges. They had navigated the treacherous currents of excess and emerged relatively unscathed, ready to face the day with a wry smile and a well-earned thirst for cool, clean water. Others, however, were not so fortunate. The floor of the hall, particularly around the hastily assembled sleeping pallets and the more permanent benches, was a testament to those who had succumbed to the onslaught of feasting. One might find a noble lord, his usually immaculate silks stained with the telltale hues of red wine and something vaguely green, snoring with a regularity that suggested a deeply compromised state of consciousness. Nearby, a knight, his armor removed and discarded carelessly, lay sprawled like a fallen statue, his face a rictus of discomfort, perhaps dreaming of endless bowls of gruel. The sounds emanating from these slumbering figures were not the gentle sighs of restful sleep, but rather a chorus of groans, gurgles, and the occasional startlingly loud expulsion of air. The lingering remnants of the feast itself offered a grim tableau. Plates, scraped clean by some, still bore the greasy testament to what had been consumed by others. Bones, picked with a savage efficiency, lay scattered like the grim detritus of a medieval wolf pack. A half-eaten boar's head, its once proud tusks now coated in a sticky sheen of congealed fat, stared blankly at the ceiling, a silent, macabre sentinel of the night's excesses. Even the ornate tapestries, depicting heroic battles and pastoral scenes, seemed to droop with a weary resignation, as if the sheer weight of the gluttony had seeped into their very threads. For those who managed to rally themselves to an upright position, The immediate priority was often a desperate search for privacy and relief. The concept of decorum, so readily discarded in the fervor of the feast, reasserted itself with a vengeance in the harsh light of morning. The communal privy, if such a luxury even existed in a manner that could cope with the morning's demands, would have been a scene of epic and no doubt unprintable proportions. More likely, a discreet retreat to a privy chamber, or even a desperate dash to the nearest shrubbery, would be the order of the day for those who found their insides staging a particularly violent rebellion. The sheer volume of bodily fluids expelled would have been prodigious, a liquid testament to the body's ultimate refusal to be pushed beyond its limits, no matter how gilded the surroundings. Beyond the immediate physical discomfort, there was the often more insidious consequence, the lingering shame, the memory of certain actions performed under the potent influence of copious amounts of wine and the unchecked indulgence of appetite could be a bitter pill to swallow. Had one, in a fit of drunken bravado, challenged the local jester to a wrestling match, had one declared undying affection to a stable boy, had one, in a particularly egregious display of excess, attempted to serenade the lady of the keep with a song that bore no resemblance to any known melody, these memories, like phantom pains, would surface unbidden, accompanied by a flush of embarrassment that had nothing to do with the lingering effects of the wine. The attempts to regain some semblance of composure were often as comical as the original excesses. Gentlemen might attempt to brush dried gravy from their tunics with a desperate, furtive motion, while ladies might try to discreetly rearrange their disheveled coiffures, their fingers still sticky from some sweet confection. The air would be filled with hushed apologies, muttered regrets, and the furtive exchange of knowing glances between those who had witnessed each other's more spectacular falls from grace. It was a silent acknowledgment of shared, albeit unpleasant, experience, a recognition that in the crucible of the feast, even the most polished facade could crack. The true measure of survival, then, was not merely in leaving the hall before the final, drunken song, but in how one navigated the morning after. It was in the ability to face the day, to hold one's head up, even if it was still swimming slightly, and to pretend, if only for a few hours, that one had not been a participant in the grand, albeit messy, spectacle of medieval excess. The feasting hall, on this dejected morning, became a stark reminder that while the body could be pushed to extraordinary limits, it always eventually exacted its price. The echoes of laughter and song had been replaced by the low groans of discomfort, and the vibrant tapestry of revelry had faded into the drab, unforgiving colors of consequence. The lessons of the feast, etched not in learned treatises, but in the churning stomachs and the throbbing heads of its participants, were as primal as they were profound. Moderation, even in the face of seemingly limitless abundance, was not merely a virtue, but a fundamental act of self-preservation. The sheer variety of maladies afflicting the survivors was, in itself, a testament to the multifaceted nature of the feast's aftermath. For some, it was the classic wine fume, a headache so profound that it felt as though the skull itself was being compressed by an unseen hand. This was often accompanied by a queasy stomach, a delicate internal ecosystem thrown into utter disarray by the onslaught of fermented grape and exotic spices. These unfortunates would be seen staggering towards the nearest source of cool water, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes darting nervously towards any object that might remotely resemble a chamber pot. Their every movement would be slow, deliberate, and agonizingly careful negotiation with the treacherous landscape of their own digestive tracts. Then there were those who had fallen victim to the more exotic offerings. A dish of suspiciously vibrant green pottage, perhaps intended to impress with its rarity, might have contained ingredients that, while perhaps considered a delicacy in some far flung region, were entirely unsuited to the robust, if unrefined, palates of the assembled company. The ensuing stomach cramps could be so intense as to render a grown man immobile, his body contorting in silent agony as his innards wrestled with an alien invader. The sheer variety of ingredients, thrown together with an almost reckless abandon, meant that pinpointing the exact culprit of such ailments could be a near impossible task, adding a layer of bewildered despair to the physical suffering. Beyond the purely physical, there was the psychological toll. The embarrassment, as previously mentioned, was a potent force. Imagine the shame of a knight, renowned for his valor on the battlefield, being discovered huddled in a corner, weeping softly because he had consumed an entire pie, meant for the king's personal consumption, only to realize his error when the royal taster's plate remained conspicuously empty, or the mortification of a lady accustomed to elegant conversation who, after one too many cups of spiced mead, had engaged in a vigorous and entirely unfounded debate about the efficacy of hedgehog quills as a cure for baldness with a distinguished visiting bishop. These were the social wounds, festering in the quiet of the morning, that could take far longer to heal than any mere stomach upset. The communal trenchers, once shared with enthusiastic abandon, now represented a subtle horror. The very idea of passing a piece of bread that had been in contact with so many different mouths, handling so many different foods, could now induce a shiver of revulsion. The shared cups, once a symbol of camaraderie, now seemed like potential vectors for a multitude of unseen evils, from the common cold to more serious, and thankfully less common, contagions. The hygiene standards, or rather the distinct lack thereof, that had been so easily overlooked in the intoxicating atmosphere of the feast, now loomed large in the sober light of day, transforming familiar objects into potential instruments of disease. The aftermath was also a time for reevaluation. For many, the sheer, unadulterated excess of the night would prompt a moment of introspection. Was the fleeting pleasure of an overflowing plate, the temporary euphoria of potent drink, truly worth the lingering discomfort and the potential for social ruin? For some, the answer would be a resounding yes, their memories already beginning to sanitize the unpleasant realities, focusing only on the moments of triumph and camaraderie. They would be the ones already planning their next indulgence, perhaps with a slightly more strategic approach to their intake, but an unwavering faith in the enduring appeal of a good, old-fashioned medieval blowout. However, for others, the experience would be a sobering, if uncomfortable, lesson. They might pledge to themselves, with all the earnestness of someone who has just narrowly escaped a plague, to embrace temperance, to seek out simpler pleasures, and to avoid the communal trough of overindulgence. These were the individuals who would look upon the scattered remnants of the feast with a mixture of disgust and profound relief. Their primary concern now, the swift and absolute cleansing of themselves and their surroundings. They would emerge from the experience with a newfound appreciation for the simple act of feeling well, a commodity that, in the grand scheme of things, proved to be far more valuable than any amount of roasted swan or spiced wine. The morning after the feast was not just a physical reckoning, but a moral one, a quiet contemplation of the fine line between robust enjoyment and self destructive abandon, a line that, on this particular night, had been so spectacularly and so grotesquely crossed by so many. The memory of the feast would linger, not just as a recollection of culinary delights, but as a stark, visceral reminder of the precarious balance between pleasure and pain, and the enduring power of the human stomach to ultimately dictate its own terms.